I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning to the sound of a thunderstorm. That alone was kind of unusual because we don't get that many thunderstorms where I live in the Portland area, especially not at night. As a storm lover, I was excited to hear thunder, and I got out of bed so I could watch the storm from my backyard. From the back of our house, we have a gorgeous, elevated, and very wide view that overlooks the Columbia River. On a clear day, I can see about 50 miles. There's also a well-established flight path that runs parallel to our view, with planes coming from and going to our international airport, PDX. Planes typically fly by at an altitude of around 500 feet and about 1 or 2 miles away from us. The approach path is highly predictable, especially at night or in bad weather, and the altitude, angle, and direction are all very consistent. I've been watching planes do this for years and it's never changed. On this night, when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the storm cloud, which was probably 5 to 10 miles away. It was massive and tall with frequent lightning, both within the cloud and branching out of it. The stars were still visible above our house and even above the cloud, and I could see that it was slowly drifting toward the hills across the river on the Washington side. As I was standing there, I saw a commercial aircraft approaching from the east and to my right, and it was heading west over the river, perfectly following the normal flight path. The plane maintained its typical descent profile, avoided the storm, and passed in front of me exactly as expected. It gradually descended and disappeared behind the trees and structures in the direction of the airport. Right around that same time, and I didn't know if this was some kind of shift or change in the storm, but the lightning stopped almost entirely and the sky seemed darker because of it. I could still make out the outline of the storm cloud because parts of it were being silhouetted by the city lights below and the stars up above it. Then I saw a second light appear. I couldn't really tell what it was, but something seemed off about it almost immediately. It only took me about 5 seconds to realize that feeling was correct. This light had come out from deep within the storm cloud, not from beneath it like it would have if it were another plane taking off, and it was moving in a straight line toward our house. It almost looked like one of the bright forward-facing landing lights that planes will use occasionally, but there was only one of them, and if it was the landing light on a plane, something was clearly wrong. No plane should be emerging from a cloud like that, especially not at night, and certainly not in the direction it was going. Planes don't approach the airport from over the hills across the river because the terrain is too high and the flight path never comes in from that angle. This light was also several thousand feet in the air. If I had to guess, I'd estimate it was between 3,000 and 5,000 feet up, which is far too high and off course for a landing approach. It wasn't until I went up on our back deck to get a slightly better view that I realized the light had completely stopped moving. I know it had been moving when it came out of the cloud, but then it had just stopped there, fixed in place. As I continued to watch while racking my brain to figure out what it was, I noticed there were no position lights anywhere on or around it. The flashing red and green beacons on the wings would have to have been there if it was a plane, but there was only the single solid white light. I stared at it for several minutes, expecting the object to either resolve itself into a plane or at the very least move its position, but it never did. Instead, the lights seemed to change very subtly in color. I can't confirm this because I was staring at it intensely, and I know your eyes can play tricks on you, but it appeared to me to change from the bright white color into a faint green, then into blue, and then back to white. It was also harder for my eyes to stay focused on it while it was doing that, and it reminded me of trying to look at something through a thick window. There was a kind of visual dissonance going on where my eyes felt like they were focused on the wrong layer. I kept expecting it to start descending or turning toward the airport, or really anything, but it still didn't move. Then it did something so completely unexpected that it physically took my breath away. I watched it reverse itself back into the cloud. It didn't turn around or fade out or have dark clouds move in front of it. It actually moved backward and slowly, and it even lit up part of the cloud around it as it re-entered the storm. As it moved back, the light gradually went out until it disappeared altogether. The strangest part, and something I had almost forgotten about, was immediately after the light was gone, the thunder and lightning started again. I could see the flashes in the cloud again, and several random bolts of lightning hit the ground. And while I stayed out there hoping to see something more, the storm continued drifting across the river and into Washington. Since that experience, I spend much more time watching for things out back than I used to. I also consider myself to be a very logical and analytical person, but I have no explanation for what I saw. My name is Emily and I'm from Boulder, Colorado. 2 years ago, something happened that was so weird, I still can't fully process it. I rarely talk about this, mostly because I don't understand what I saw, but I thought this might be a good place to share it. I was 29 and had recently moved in with my friend Claire after a horrible breakup and losing the apartment I had been in. Claire lives in a house that her parents own in North Boulder, and she let me rent out one side of it that is basically a mother-in-law suite. It had a large bedroom with its own bathroom, a separate entrance door, and the whole thing was split from the rest of the house by the kitchen, which we shared. Next door to Claire's house, there was a woman who lived alone named Edith. I had only met her one time, but she was the sweetest elderly woman you could ever meet who had to be in her late 80s. We would see her son and what I'm guessing were other members of his family stop by at least once a week to bring her groceries and mow the lawn and help her with whatever. About a month after I moved in, there was a night where I had covered a later shift for someone at work and I got home around 11:30. I took a shower as soon as I got home, and when I was done, I opened the bathroom window to let the steam out. That bathroom window looked directly at Edith's dining room window next door, which if you looked into, you could see her table and a sliding glass door that went out to her back patio. When I opened the bathroom window, I happened to notice that the light was on in Edith's dining room, which didn't seem normal because it was so late. When I looked into her house, I saw her standing at the sliding glass door, right at the glass with her face almost touching it, and she was just staring outside. I thought she might be on the phone because I could see her mouth moving and she was making small hand gestures, but she wasn't holding anything, and there was no one else there. I only saw her doing this for a minute, then she left the room and the light went off. It was weird, but that was it. About a week after that, I woke up to go to the bathroom and again could see her dining room light was on through my window. I had to open mine to see anything because the glass was frosted, but when I did, she was there in the same spot again and standing at the glass door. I could see her talking and moving her hands like the first time, but this time it looked more like she was arguing with someone. I couldn't hear anything, but you could tell by the way she was moving her arms around that she was upset. I watched her do this for a solid 5 minutes, but then like before, she walked out of the room and the light went off. That time I told Claire about it the next day and we both thought it could be some kind of dementia or something similar, and we decided not to do anything unless it got worse since her family was clearly involved with her care. I also didn't want her family to think that I was spying or watching her late at night. Just 2 nights after that, I saw it happen a third time. Edith was standing at the sliding glass door and talking again, but this time there was something different. I don't know if it was me still being half asleep or my eyes were still adjusting, but it looked like there was someone, or more accurately something, standing on the other side of the glass on her patio. It was so hard to tell because it was dark, but it looked like a single dark figure and the shape was not normal. I don't know what it looked like, but it did not look like a normal human being. It only took me 30 seconds to know for sure that it wasn't me and something was actually standing there because I could see it moving and Edith just stood there staring at it and talking to it. I'm not going to lie, it was a disturbing thing to see, but I couldn't look away. I leaned forward and put my forehead against the screen to get a better view of what was going on, and then the most startling and terrifying thing I have ever experienced happened. Edith turned her head and looked directly at me. This wasn't like she slowly looked around the room and happened to see me looking out my window. I swear she instantly looked me right in the eyes, and I got this feeling like something had told her to do it. It was the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. As soon as she did that, I physically jumped away from the window and my stomach felt like it was in my throat. I felt exposed and almost humiliated, like I had been caught spying on her or something. I ran straight into Claire's room, woke her up and told her everything. I was actually in tears while I was telling her because it had scared me so badly. Claire got out of bed and we both tried to peek out the kitchen window to check, but by the time we did that, the light was off next door and there was nobody there. To give you an idea of how much this affected me, that night I slept in an old sleeping bag on the floor in Claire's room. There was no possible way I could be alone, and I felt like I wanted to board up my bathroom window forever. When we got up in the morning, Claire and I talked about it, and she was concerned about Edith and her health, or more specifically her mental health, so she ended up walking over to check on her. I didn't go, but I guess she answered the door normally and was her usual sweet self. Not a single thing happened next door for the next 5 days. On the 5th night, and again pretty late at night, I woke up to bright flashing lights coming through my bathroom window. These lights were completely different and had different colors to them, so I forced myself to open the window just enough to see outside. As soon as I looked out, I could see there was an ambulance parked right in front of Edith's house with a fire truck behind it, and I could see that paramedics were inside. I stood there and watched them roll her out on a stretcher, and she definitely wasn't moving. I got Claire up immediately, and we both walked outside onto our front porch and watched them load her into the back of the ambulance and drive away. We didn't even find out what happened until days later when her son was at the house. I caught him outside when I got home from work and asked if Edith was okay, and sadly, he told me she had had a heart attack and passed away. I guess she had managed to push some kind of emergency call button, but by the time they got her to the hospital, it was too late. I still think about Edith and everything that happened all the time. It really traumatized me and it changed something in me. Never in my life have I thought the paranormal or aliens or ghosts were real, but I saw her talking to something that last night at her back door. There was something standing right on the other side of the glass that I know was not a person, and there is nothing in this world that could ever get the image of her looking over at me out of my head. The fact that she passed away only days after that has made me much more open to things beyond our understanding. It makes me think of the saying that seeing is believing, because the old me would never believe a story like this. Now that I have personally seen something so unexplainable though, I can never go back to thinking everything has an explanation. My story happened when I was only 6 years old, so I don't remember it myself, not clearly anyway. But my mom tells me the story, and every time she tells it, it gives me chills. She says it's the creepiest thing she's ever experienced, and I believe her. I had her write out every detail for me, and here's what happened. When I was young, my mom, my grandma, and I were staying at a family friend's beach house near Cape Cod. Specifically, it was a big oceanfront house on LeCount Hollow Beach in Wellfleet. I shared a bed and a bedroom with my mom, and in our room, we had a sliding glass door that went out to a balcony that overlooked the ocean. On our first night, my mom says I woke her up in the middle of the night and kept telling her there was a light show going on outside over the ocean. She didn't see anything and just assumed I was seeing people walking down to the beach at night with flashlights, and then just told me to go back to sleep, but I kept doing it. I guess I woke her up several more times that night saying the same thing. Every couple of hours, I would shake her and tell her the lights were back. By the early morning hours, I was telling her there were people outside and not just lights, and at that point, she was getting frustrated with me for keeping her up most of the night. With the threat of having to sleep in my own room if I kept waking her up, I finally stopped. The next day was a beach day, and my mom thought I was going to crash hard at bedtime because we had been out in the sun all day, but I didn't. Again, in the middle of the night, she says she woke up because my face was actually pressing against hers and she could feel me breathing on her. She jolted awake and asked me what I was doing, and I said that I needed a glass of milk and told her we had to go into the kitchen. After telling me to go back to sleep several times, she eventually decided to get up and get the milk, and I went with her. She got up, walked me into the kitchen, then poured a glass of milk and handed it to me. She says that as soon as I grabbed the milk, I told her I didn't actually want it. Extremely frustrated, she asked me why I had dragged her out of bed in the middle of the night to get milk, and I guess I told her I didn't want the milk, I just wanted us to get out of that bedroom. She was confused and annoyed and asked me why, and apparently I told her that when I had seen the lights the night before, I didn't tell her everything. There was a little girl that had walked up to the sliding door, and I talked to her through the glass. I don't remember any of this, but my mom says I described the girl as about the same age as me, and I guess she tried to get me to come outside with her, but I told her no and I never opened the door. Then I told her the reason I wanted to leave the room and get milk was because the girl said she was going to come back and that they wanted to take both of us, whatever that meant. My mom says it was the single most chilling thing she has ever heard, especially because it was coming from a 6-year-old and in such a matter-of-fact way. I wasn't crying or really scared, I was just stating it like it was a normal factual thing. She didn't know what to say and didn't want to wake up my grandma, so we went to bed in one of the other bedrooms that night, and she said we could talk about it more in the morning. She does emphasize, though, that it was one of the most uncomfortable nights of her life, and both of us were tossing and turning. You'd think that would be the weirdest part, but it was actually what happened on our last day that sealed the deal for my mom. We were out on the beach in the morning before we had to leave, and the neighbors were out too. They were the owners of the house next door, and my grandma had known them for years. They had 2 kids who I was playing with, but at some point while the adults were all talking, my mom told them about my 2 nights of waking her up. That's when the man chimed in and said he was out on their back deck late that first night watching the ocean, and he saw lights too. He said he was positive they were not flashlights or boats or anything like that, and he watched them looping around out over the water not far from shore. They weren't moving like anything he'd seen before, and he thought of it as an actual UFO sighting. Up until that moment, my mom had basically written it all off as something I dreamt up or was imagining, but after her conversation with the neighbor, she says she knew something had actually happened. None of us have ever figured out what I saw that weekend, especially since so many years have gone by, but my mom still gets seriously freaked out when she thinks about me seeing a light show in the sky, then talking to a little girl on the other side of the sliding glass door in our bedroom in the middle of the night. And the fact that it freaks her out as much as it does, that's what really freaks me out. This was in 2007 and in the middle of summer. I live in Ronan, Montana on 10 acres with my family. On the weekend this happened, my wife and son had gone to a place called Fairmont Hot Springs, which is about 2 hours away from us, to meet up with her sister and her sister's kids. I had stayed home to finish some work around the property and get my truck fixed. On that Saturday, I had spent the entire day working my way down a list of things that needed to get done, and the last thing I needed to do before dark was to put a new fuel filter in my truck. I had it parked on the west side of our barn because I have a big shop light there that I was using, and my dog Duke was with me because he follows me everywhere when I'm working outside. I was halfway under the truck and had just started when Duke got up and started barking. It startled me enough that I slid back out to see what was going on, and I thought someone might be coming up the driveway, but when I stood up and looked around, there was nothing happening. I didn't think much of it at the time and figured he must have seen an animal, so I got back under the truck, but later I realized his barking had more significance. Not even a minute later and he was barking again. That time I didn't get up, I just yelled at him to knock it off and kept working. As soon as I had yelled at him, I heard him take off running toward the house, and I assumed it was an animal that he was now chasing. The second he ran off, there was a bright red glow that I could see around me, mostly on my legs and on the ground around the truck. This glow got really bright, and I was lying there wondering if something was going on with my shop light, but before I could really think much about it, I started to feel heat on my legs, and it immediately dawned on me that my barn was on fire. Right when I tried to pull myself back out from under the truck, my entire body felt like it suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. I could still move slightly, but it took everything I had to barely lift my arms and legs off the ground. I guess the best way I can describe it is it felt like gravity got stronger and it was pulling me into the ground. The last thing I remember, and this is weird, was hearing something that sounded exactly like a jackhammer. Then I got lightheaded and put my head back in the dirt and completely blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was staring at dry grass and dirt right in front of my face. I didn't even know where I was at first because I was disoriented, kind of like when you wake up from being knocked out cold, but I realized I was lying on my side about 5 feet away from my truck and facing the barn. As I started to remember what I'd been doing before waking up in the grass, it didn't make any sense because I knew I was under the truck and on my back. I heard Duke's caller as I was getting up, and he walked right up to me like nothing had happened. At this point, I didn't have any memory of the red light or the heat on my legs. My explanation was that I had been working all day in the heat with not enough water and I had fainted, even though that really didn't add up. If I had passed out while I was under the truck, I couldn't understand how I'd ended up several feet away and facing in the opposite direction. Either way, I have a bit of a get-her-done attitude, and I still had to finish my work. So I went in the house, drank 2 full glasses of water and washed off my face, then went back outside to finish the truck and everything was normal. That night, the only other thing that happened was my wife called to check in and say goodnight. I did tell her about my fainting spell outside, but I downplayed it so she didn't worry about me. The next day was Sunday, and after church, the only thing I had to do was tidy up the house and take a mower tire in to get fixed before my wife and son got home. While I was in the kitchen cleaning, I got this instant sharp headache. It wasn't a regular one, it was a severe pressure, and it was accompanied by red flashes in my vision. I would be lying if I said it didn't scare me a little, but again, I had things to get done, and I told myself it was probably a symptom of getting so dehydrated the day before. It did shake me up a little, but it only lasted a minute, and then I got back to work. The exact same thing happened again a couple hours later. While I was sitting in my truck at Les Schwab, which is just a local tire shop in town, it was the same sharp headache with the same red flashes in my vision. I physically shook my head that time to make it go away, which actually seemed to work. Again, it did concern me a little, but not enough to do anything about it because it was short-lived like the first one. After my wife and son were home and we were in bed that night like usual, I had what I'm going to call a dream because I don't know what else to call it, but it was closer to a replay. In my dream, I was back under my truck and working on it alone, exactly like I had been that Saturday. I saw the red glow that I thought was a fire, and I felt the heat on my legs, and then I felt that immense pressure holding me down to the ground again. All of these details I had completely forgotten about before fainting. This replay went further though, and in the blink of an eye, I went from lying under my truck to sitting in a chair and communicating with something, but I didn't know what it was. I was shouting things out loud trying to find out what was going on, but I was only getting answers back in my mind, if that makes sense. I never saw anyone or anything. It was just me in a chair in what I suppose was a room, but I wasn't paying attention to it. Brace yourself because this sounds crazy to most people, and it still does to me too, but after that I was given some information. First, I was told that I was randomly chosen and completely safe. Then I was told we are rare and important and something along the lines of an endangered species. I don't even know what to call it, but I got a strong sense that whoever this was cared about us. Not in some scientific way, it was more than that. It was like we were something precious and irreplaceable, and they actually wanted us to survive. Then my dream just ended with that, and I jerked awake and sat up in bed. I spent the early morning telling my wife everything that had actually happened while she was gone and what I experienced in the dream. Like I said, I think of it more like a replay than a dream because I had forgotten what happened to me under the truck, and when I replayed it in my mind that night, that's how I remembered. That was the last time anything happened. I never had another dream or headache or encounter of any kind. Of course, I have never forgotten it, and actually, it's been quite the opposite. The memories of what happened to me under the truck and everything that was told to me in that replay only got more vivid over time. I've had years to think it through, and I believe we are being watched. Not in a bad or threatening way at all, though. My feelings are that it's more like something out there is actually looking out for us and maybe even protecting us in certain ways. It really made me look at life differently. Not just having experienced all of it, but I find myself being a kinder person. even down to finding a spider in the house and catching it to put it outside rather than killing it. I can't really explain it. I guess I just look at all life with a little more importance now. I am an only child who grew up on a farm in Washington State. We had neighboring farms and land around us, but from where our house was, we could only ever see one other neighbor. There was one gas station with a small convenience store up the road from us, but other than that, getting into town was about a 10-mile drive. Between the ages of 8 and 10 years old, I used to love playing outside with my dog and best friend Bailey more than anything. I also loved begging my parents to let me camp outside in a tent with him overnight, which they did let me do. When they first let me do it, my dad would stay with Bailey and me, but I wanted to camp out there so much in the summer months that he got tired of it, so they eventually let me do it alone. Even though I was really young, I still have the best memories of spending nights out in our backyard alone with Bailey, stargazing and flipping through Highlights magazine with a flashlight and falling asleep with him right next to me. I used to pretend that we were on these huge adventures miles out into the wilderness together, and it was just a really fun time in my life. During that time, I also have a memory of watching certain stars move in the most amazing ways. It didn't seem weird to me at all as a kid, but I remember watching single stars do tricks and make patterns in the sky. They would even come closer, then move farther away, and in my memories of it, it was a fun and playful thing, and it always seemed like they were putting on a private show just for me. This could have been the wild imagination of a young mind, but I do remember actually seeing it, and often, and I can even remember what they looked like. On one of our camping nights, I woke up and noticed Bailey wasn't next to me. He rarely left my side even during the day, and he had never taken off from the tent at night, so I knew something was wrong. Right away, I got up, unzipped the tent, and went out to look for him. What I didn't even think about at the time, and this is a very strange detail I didn't realize until later in my life, is that he had gotten out of a fully zipped up tent, which was still closed when I went out. When I was standing on the edge of our backyard, it only took me a minute to find him, and he was lying down alone under one of our big trees about 30 feet from the tent. I called his name several times, but he didn't move, which was way out of character for him. I remember getting the worst sick in my stomach feeling, thinking he was either injured or had died while I was asleep. I started walking over to him while still calling his name, and as I got closer, I realized there was a boy about my age kneeling down by his back legs, but this boy had been mostly behind the tree, so I couldn't see him until I had gotten closer. It did startle me a little to see him there, but I don't think I was really afraid. I was mostly worried about my dog. As soon as he made eye contact with me, he said, "Go, Bailey," and smacked him on his stomach. Bailey instantly jumped up and started barking at the kid like crazy. It wasn't like a bark from a car pulling up our driveway. It was like an actual scary intruder bark. I watched the boy take several steps backward, then he just started running away. I actually yelled out for him to come back because I thought he looked exactly like a kid from my school named Ryan. Whoever he was though, he didn't look back once, and all of the barking and yelling had woken up my parents, who then came out and made me sleep inside. I told them exactly what had happened with Bailey and how I'd seen the kid from school, and I remember them not believing a word I was saying. They just sat me down and repeatedly asked me for the truth. As a kid, I didn't grasp how impossible it would have been for one of my classmates to be hanging out on our farm in the middle of the night and sitting with my unconscious dog under a tree. My parents weren't happy about it, and after that night, they stopped letting me camp outside. In my mind, that was all that ever happened, and my childhood went on like normal. What I didn't realize is there was a whole other part to the story that I didn't know until I was an adult. When I was in my 20s and in the middle of a totally unrelated conversation with my parents, that story happened to come up. Out of the blue, my mom reminded me that I had seen a counselor after that because I was having recurring dreams and sneaking out of the back door at night. I did vaguely remember going to a counselor for a short time, but I had no recollection at all of the dreams or sneaking out of the house at 10 years old. My parents remembered everything though, and they told me every detail. What they say is that I would have a dream, which I told them was the same every time. Then I would get up in the middle of the night to sneak outside and play with Ryan from school. My story was that Ryan and I would run out into the woods together to meet up with his brothers. I also told my mom that every one of his brothers looked exactly like him, which she says gave her chills when she heard it. I would talk about playing games in the trees with them and the adventures they would take me on, and even wrestling with them in our hayfield. I guess the hayfield was kind of a central place where I would meet with them and say goodbye to them, which is really odd when I think about it. I had no memory of any of it, so the therapy must have worked, but talking about it did spark a memory of something else. I really did know someone at school named Ryan, and we went to school together from elementary all the way through middle school. I remembered talking to him once about playing together and him being over at my house, but he told me he had never been to my house and that we had never done anything together. Back then, I just took it as him not wanting to hang out anymore, and I really didn't care or think much more about it than that. When I look back at the timeline, it seems like I had that actual conversation with Ryan at school right around the time I stopped seeing the counselor, and I guess my weird behaviors all stopped from what my parents tell me. Ryan became just another kid I'd see at school, but I never really talked to him again. In between middle school and high school, we moved to a different state because of my dad's job, and I never saw the real Ryan again. After learning the other half of the story from my parents, I really have no idea what was happening back then. I could totally believe I had an imaginary friend or was just dreaming all of it if it had happened when I was 3 or 4 years old, but not 10 going on 11. That was the age I was thinking about sports and starting to look at girls differently. I've always had a good imagination, but I'm not crazy. I do know the difference between reality and fantasy, and I know I did then too. One of these days, I'd really like to take a trip back to Washington and drive by our old house just to see if any other memories come up. I know my parents clearly remember everything, but now I'm very curious about it, and I'd like to remember it too. I was born and raised in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My best friend, who I don't want to name, lived in a more upper-class area than I did with large lots that were surrounded by hills. His family had such a nice house with a huge yard that I loved spending time at, and I was out there all the time when we were kids. We went to school together from kindergarten all the way through high school, and I spent the night at his house more times than I can count. A couple of things about him, which seemed totally normal to me at the time, was that whenever I stayed the night, he would always have to wear this sleep mask over his eyes when we went to bed. His mom said it helped him sleep better, so I never questioned anything. It was just his thing. And then, on many different occasions, he would clearly talk in his sleep. This wasn't just a few random words, he would have actual conversations in his sleep. It was actually funny to hear back then, and if it went on for too long or it was keeping me up, I would nudge him or make a loud noise to make him stop. After years of this, it became a normal thing he did, and it was just part of staying the night there. It wasn't until we were in 8th grade that I got curious and actually started paying attention to what he was saying. That's when I realized how weird it was, and when I tell you this, you'll see what I mean. He would have these long, clear, and coherent conversations with a separate family that was not his parents, and I guess they were from an entirely different place outside of our solar system. He would ask about their long trips, which always sounded like it took them months to get to him. I would also hear him answering specific questions about school and about his actual parents and friends, and sometimes his answers would get oddly personal about his physical health, like more than I wanted to know about him if I'm being totally honest. It was almost like he was being quizzed or answering some kind of checklist, and this happened many separate times where he would give different answers each time as we got older. Over time, I got moderately obsessed with this alternate reality he seemed to be living in when he was asleep, and I pieced together a couple of things. First, he would talk to this other family often, and they would come to see him in person once or twice a year. When they did, it was a big deal. Second, it was always the same type of conversation where this other set of parents would check in with him. I never said a word about it because it felt weird to me back then and I didn't want him to be embarrassed. I also figured it was some kind of sleep disorder that they all knew about since his mom openly made him wear his sleep mask every night. By the time we were in high school, he seemed to grow out of it, or at least I didn't notice it anymore. And during our junior and senior years, I wasn't staying over there anymore because we were both older and busy with finishing school and girlfriends and everything else that comes with transitioning into adult life. After we graduated, I went to college in Maryland and only came back during holidays. We always kept in touch but didn't see each other in person for a few years. Then, when we were 22, I came back for a 2-week visit and ended up going out to his house again for dinner and to catch up since he was still living at home. His parents were always like family to me, and we spent most of the evening eating, drinking, and talking. Later that night, the two of us were down in his basement/rec room, which was where we used to sleep and hang out when we were kids. We were making drinks and laughing about old times and the shenanigans we used to get into, and it was really a fun night. Maybe it was the alcohol, but I finally brought up how he used to talk in his sleep, and I asked him if he ever knew he was doing it. This is something that I wish I had never done. The look on his face when I asked that question was so weird, and he immediately got nervous and defensive. He did answer me and told me he knew, but then he started aggressively prying into what I had heard him say and why I cared about it. I was totally honest with him because he was like a brother to me and basically gave him a condensed version of everything. This is a guy I've known my entire life, but as he sat there asking me all these questions, I felt like I didn't even know him. It was like an actual Jekyll and Hyde change in his personality, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. Right in the middle of this, he got up and just walked upstairs. I stayed on the couch and felt horrible about bringing it up. I didn't really know what to do, but I could hear him upstairs talking to his parents. I couldn't understand anything they were saying, but he was up there for a long time, probably 10 minutes. Then when he finally came back downstairs, he told me it was getting late and that he had to work in the morning. I have always been horrible with confrontation and uncomfortable situations, so I quietly took that as my cue to go home. I did apologize for bringing it up, which he really didn't respond to, and as I was grabbing my stuff upstairs and leaving, I thanked his parents for having me over and told them how nice it was to see them again, but all three of them were acting so weird with me after that. It was like they all suddenly didn't want me there anymore and they were rushing to get me out. When I left their house, I felt really upset about the whole night. I didn't even know what I did wrong, and I have never felt such negative energy toward me in my entire life. It was like they had some big family secret and I knew something about it, so they cast me out. I don't really know how to explain it. Unfortunately, our friendship was never the same after that. I've only seen him one single time since that happened, and it was at a mutual friend's house and completely on accident. I stayed in Maryland after college because I got a job here, but I still text him now and then to see how things are going. That's really the extent of our contact with each other though, just small talk via text message. We never talk on the phone anymore, and he's never once asked to get together when I go back home. I don't know what happened, but it bothers me a lot, and I feel like I lost a family member. The reason I wanted to tell my story is because this has been on my mind nearly every day for several years. I don't know when this hit me exactly, but at some point I asked myself a very out-of-the-box question, and that question was, what if it was real? That thought had never even occurred to me, but once it did, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he really was communicating with other beings? What if he actually did have a separate family from somewhere beyond what we know or understand? What if his actual parents know about it, or even crazier, are part of it? And if any of those are true, what does that make him? I don't know the answer to any of those questions. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to just show up at his door and bluntly ask what happened and figure out what he's not telling me, but being the way I am, I can't ever see myself doing that. For now, I'll just keep checking in with him when I can and hope that he'll decide to make the first move someday. I really hope he does, because I miss my friend, no matter who he is. My experience happened in the summer of 1994. I was 41 years old at the time and living in Northeast Portland, Oregon. My son was 14 and he had two best friends in the neighborhood, one that lived right next door and the other about a half a block away. They had all been begging me to do some kind of summer camping trip, so I decided to take them out to Pacific City for the weekend on the Oregon coast for a boys' trip. Pacific City today is a totally different place than it was back then. It has completely blown up with tourists and big houses and expensive hotels, but when we were there, it was quiet and barely on the map unless you were a local. It's quite a ways off the main highway that runs down the coast, so there were never any crowds and it was just a sleepy little beach town. To give you an idea of where we were camping, there is a giant 250-foot sand dune right on the main beach in Pacific City, and the whole area is called Cape Kiwanda. Most people stay on the south side of the sand dune where the town is, and on that side you can drive and play on the beach and hike up to the top of the dune, which is actually a blast to do because you can run back down it at full speed. Where we were was on the north side of the dune and way up on a separate sandy cliff that's surrounded by trees. The camp spot itself was right on the edge and had one of the most incredible views of the ocean that you can get. I don't know if you can even get there anymore, but for any Oregonians that might want to know the exact location, it's just north of town on McPhillips Drive. Then you can take a left on a dirt road called Ridge Road, and then follow that until it dead ends and you're there. There were never any signs or markers. We would just park at the dead end, then walk through the trees and out to the edge where there was a sandy patch. I would also be curious if anyone else has ever seen anything out there. When we got there, the boys spent the entire first day down on the beach, running up and down the dune, and walking back down the road into town to get candy and drinks from the one small convenience store. That night, they all crashed in their tent around 11 o'clock while I stayed up. Before going to bed, I made myself a vodka drink and sat in a folding chair listening to the ocean and watching the night sky. Around 11:30 though, I started noticing very small flashes behind me. They were just little flickers of light through the trees that weren't very bright, but they were enough to get my attention and make me turn around a few times. I remember hoping it wasn't someone else up there trying to find our secret campsite. Eventually I got up to check it out, and I needed to go to the bathroom before bed anyway, so I walked back into the trees a few feet and stood there waiting to see it again. While I was standing there and literally in the middle of going to the bathroom, I saw something I truly cannot explain. There was a small swarm of tiny green lights rising up from the forest floor. It looked like there were maybe 20 or 30 of them in total, and they were all hovering and floating around inside the trees without making a single sound. Some of them were closer to me, which had to be only about 20 feet away, and then some were farther in and deeper into the trees. The only thing I could compare it to was lightning bugs, like I remembered from when I grew up in Ohio, but these didn't blink. They were solid, steady lights, and every one of them was a stunning emerald green color. I had never heard of lightning bugs in Oregon, especially not on the coast, but in the moment that's all I could come up with. After watching them float around for just a few seconds, the whole cluster of them rose up together and disappeared into the upper canopy of the trees, and I could see that some of them were even taking off into the air above. I just stood there completely dumbfounded and had no frame of reference for what I had just seen. I probably stood in the trees for another 10 minutes staring and hoping they would come back, but when they didn't, I finally went back to my chair, finished my drink, and tried to come up with a logical explanation. I came to the conclusion that it had to be some kind of coastal insect or firefly phenomenon, like a bioluminescent bug that I didn't know about. It didn't make total sense to me, but I didn't wake up the boys or make a big deal out of it. I just went to bed. The next day was totally normal, but I did tell my son and his friends what I had seen, which barely got a reaction. They took off to do their thing again, and I pulled out an old hang glider that I had strapped to the top of the car. I wasn't going to actually launch off of anything. I just thought it would be fun to put together and let the boys run down the smaller dunes with it to catch a few feet of air. That night was almost a carbon copy of the first one. The boys were exhausted and in their tent by 11, and I stayed up again with another drink and in the same chair. This time I was actually hoping to see the lights again. After turning around to look in the trees every couple of minutes for a solid hour, I did finally see them again, but this time they were floating over the beach about 100 feet below us. From where we were on the ridge, I could perfectly see that it was the exact same emerald green lights in a swarm and floating just above the sand. I can't quite explain how excited I was to see this for the second time. Without even thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and started walking down the steep hill toward them. I didn't take my eyes off them the whole time, and they were just staying there in a loose cluster right on the beach. When I was about 3/4 of the way down the hill and only about 50 feet from them, I watched the entire swarm quickly move away from me and go out over the water. They got to one spot over the waves, then dropped straight down into the water. Pacific City has an extremely gradual beach, so this wasn't deep water. You can walk pretty far out and still only be in up to your knees. I ran to the bottom of the hill and toward the water, and I could still see them moving under the surface. I could easily see they were all still together and active. Then as I got closer to the water, they did go out where it gets deeper and dove down until I lost sight of them. I really want to emphasize how incredible this was. Whatever I had seen hit me on an emotional level, and I remember standing on the beach alone, literally on the verge of tears when I watched them disappear in the water. I stood out there scanning the beach and the water, talking to myself out loud and hoping I would see something, anything, but that was it. I have no idea how long I stayed down there, but eventually I walked back up the hill to camp, immediately woke up my son and his friends, and told them what had just happened. They were a little more interested this time, but also too tired to care much, though they did say it sounded cool. I don't think they fully grasped how weird and impossible it actually was. I stayed up in my chair for several more hours and barely got any sleep that night. The next morning, we had to pack up early and get back to Portland. I had to work the next day, so unfortunately I had no choice but to leave. If I had had a choice, I would have stayed another week just for the chance to see them even one more time. Back at home and during the following week, I told my wife, my coworkers, my friends, and really anyone else who would listen. I'm perfectly fine saying I wouldn't shut up about it for a few weeks. Everyone I knew had spent time on the coast, and not one person I talked to had ever heard of lightning bugs or anything like it on the coast or anywhere else in Oregon. If they were insects, they didn't behave like any I've ever seen, and I've never even heard of an insect that not only lights up, but can swarm in the trees one night, then go completely underwater in the ocean the next. I literally saw them glowing under the water, at night and in the freezing cold ocean. I don't know how that's even possible. I am now 72 years old and still living in Portland. I've been out to the coast 100 times since it happened, and I've still never seen anything like it. It was just a once-in-a-lifetime thing that I was lucky enough to see. Everyone who knows me knows the story, but I'd sure love to meet someone else who has seen it too. My name is Kate. I'm 28 and I've been traveling the western US in a camper van with my dog Birch since February of 2024. Call it a quarter-life crisis, but I left a really good job to figure things out and get a break from real life. I found a guy named Bob on YouTube who runs a channel called Cheap RV Living, and his videos changed me and made me realize I wasn't living the life I wanted to be living. I pulled out a large chunk of my savings and bought a 2019 Transit camper van that was set up for full-time, off-grid living. I know that all sounds cliche and overdone since so many people are doing it, but it really was one of the best decisions I've ever made. My story has a few parts to it, so I'll do my best to tell them because I believe they're connected. In May of last year, I was traveling through southeastern Arizona, and I had been at a camping area called Indian Bread Rocks near Bowie. On the day we got there, and after getting the van set up, Birch and I took a walk through the boulders behind our site to check everything out. So you can get an idea of where we were, there are incredible rock formations everywhere, along with huge balancing rocks, and it's all surrounded by desert ridges and buttes. It's really a beautiful area and feels totally remote and quiet. After dinner that night, Birch and I watched a movie on my iPad. Then at around 10:30, I went outside to bring my folding camp chair in and let Birch out before bed. Right when I stepped out of the van, I saw 3 lights directly above the ridge behind my sight. They weren't high up like where a plane would fly, they were only a few hundred feet off the top of the ridge. All 3 of them were moving in slow looping patterns around each other, almost like they were dancing, and every 30 seconds or so, they would make a perfect triangle shape, then break apart and dance around more. I really didn't know how to feel about what I was seeing because it was just weird and mesmerizing. I only watched it for a few minutes, then all 3 of the lights dropped behind the other side of the ridge and I couldn't see them anymore. Right away, I figured someone was out there flying drones. I will say though, I never did hear any sounds, but that could have been because they were too far away from me. I thought it was a cool thing to see, but that was about it. I got back in the van, locked up, and went to bed. That same night, just before 1 a.m., I woke up to loud noises and flashing lights outside the van. The noises are super hard to describe, but think of really quick and loud whale sounds like you'd hear underwater in the ocean. They were similar to that, and every time I'd hear one, I would see several fast pulses of blue light through the cracks in my window covers. At this point, I was thoroughly freaking out, and Birch was barking loud. Thank God he's a bigger dog with a bark that sounds way more menacing than it is, because I felt like it would scare most people away if they heard it. I did have a can of bear spray ready, and I was convinced some psycho was going to start yanking on one of the doors, but it only lasted a few minutes. After it stopped, I wanted to look outside so badly to see what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the window cover off. It took me a full 15 minutes of dead silence, then I finally took the window cover off the sliding door and didn't see a thing outside except dark desert. The only idea I could come up with was that there might have been people out there riding electric motorcycles or bikes at night, and I was hearing their electric motors and seeing the headlights flashing. That's a pretty weak explanation though. Fully awake at that point, I double-checked my locks and tried to sleep. It took a while, but I know I fell asleep because I had the single weirdest dream I've ever had. In this dream, I actually woke up to someone knocking on the side door of the van. It seems weird to say that I woke up in a dream, but that's what happened. When I opened the slider, my mom was standing there. She lives in East Texas, so that would make no sense, but in the dream it felt totally normal. She was her usual happy self and asked if I wanted to come out by the fire and talk, so of course I did. We sat right outside the van and talked around the fire pit for what felt like a long time. She was asking me how my trip was going and if Birch was having a good time, but then went into questions that weren't like her, like why I chose to leave my job and why people in general feel that they need to get away from other people and responsibilities. Those aren't questions she would ask me because she already knew why I left and why I'm attracted to more of a nomad lifestyle. She has a hippie side to her too and has always been supportive of my lifestyle. It just felt off and not like her, and to be totally honest, I felt like I was being interrogated in a way. At the end of the dream, she gave me a big hug that felt very real and loving. Then she said goodnight and walked away. Literally down the road and out into the desert at night. That's how the dream ended, and because it was a dream, I guess I didn't see any problem with that. This is the part that in my mind connects everything and deeply freaks me out. When I woke up, it was early morning and I felt completely drained, physically and mentally. I remember making an extra strong coffee, and then when I opened the door to let Birch out, the very first thing I noticed was that the fire pit at my campsite had fresh ashes and a few partially burned logs in it. I physically had to take a step back because it looked like someone had been there while I was sleeping. I did not have a fire at any time while I was there. I saw the pit when I got there, and it had nothing in it but dirt from whoever had been there before me. Seeing the fresh fire like that gave me a sinking feeling in my stomach, along with a full reality check that I was a woman camping alone in the middle of nowhere. I realized it came down to 2 possibilities. Either someone came into my campsite in the middle of the night and made a fire, which was highly unlikely because Birch would have noticed and freaked out, or something else happened that I can't explain. Either way, I didn't feel safe out there, so I packed up and drove into Tucson to get a hotel. Here are my final thoughts about the whole thing. I believe all 3 things were connected. I saw the lights over the ridge, then I was woken up by the weirdest noises and lights outside the van, then dreamt my mom showed up to sit around the campfire and talk. I personally feel like it wasn't a dream and that I was visited by something, and I feel like whatever it was showed itself to me in a way that would be familiar by using my mom's image. The main reason I think it actually happened and wasn't a dream is finding the ashes and logs in the fire pit. I didn't even touch that thing, and then it magically had the remnants of a fire in it after everything else that happened. All those things together are just too weird. My name is Logan. I was born and raised in Hanover, New Hampshire, but now live with my family in Virginia. When I was 13, my dog Millie, a beautiful 60-pound German Shepherd, saved me from being lured out of my house by something. I use the word something because I never completely understood what was trying to get to me, but I have a gut feeling. If it weren't for Millie, I don't know what would have happened to me. When I was growing up, our house was on the south side of Greensboro Road, just outside of Hanover, and behind our house was nothing but hills and trees. About a week prior to my experience, my dad saw something that he wouldn't stop talking about and also ties into my story. It was at night and he was outside working because he always had a project going on, and he said he saw a small plane going in circles extremely low behind us like it was going to crash. Then he swore he watched it go down somewhere in the trees and not far from our house. I remember him being so serious and amped up about it, then taking off in his truck to go find it. I was young, so I don't remember every detail, but he came home later without finding anything. I know he made some phone calls that night too, but I don't know if it was to the police or our neighbors or what. For days after that happened, he kept bringing it up over and over again. We never did hear a report about a plane crash or got any other information, so who knows what it was that he saw. The following weekend was my parents' anniversary, and that Saturday night they went into town for dinner and were staying a single night in a hotel. I was supposed to be home with my older brother Colton, who was 16, but he ended up leaving for half the night without telling our parents. He made us pizza and watched TV with me for a while, then 2 of his friends picked him up to go to a girl's house. I didn't care and I would never rat him out, but it was a typical big brother thing to do while we were home alone. After he left, it was just Millie and me, and she was laying next to me on the couch in front of the TV. I was right on the edge of falling asleep when our power flickered off and on. It wasn't a full outage, but it was enough to make the TV shut off. I got up and turned the TV back on, then went to the kitchen to get something to drink. While I was leaning into the fridge, the power flickered again. Our kitchen window was on the back of the house and faced south toward the woods, and I remember standing up just in time to look out the window and see what I can only guess was the same thing my dad saw. It looked exactly like a small plane flying in a circle way too low, basically barely above the trees and dropping. I'm pretty sure I said, "How is this happening?" again out loud. I couldn't believe how close it was either, like crash into the house close. But by the time I walked out the back door, it was gone. No plane and no engine sound. It definitely woke me up and I couldn't wait to tell my dad that I had seen the same thing, but being a dumb teenager, I just went back to the couch. The second I sat down, I heard someone call my name as clear as a bell. It was quiet, and if the TV had been any louder, I probably wouldn't have heard it, but it was for sure coming from outside. It sounded like whoever it was standing on the back deck. Then I heard it a second time, and that one made Millie jump off the couch with her ears up. Then it happened again and she started barking. That confirmed that I wasn't just hearing things. Let me tell you, my first thought was not fear, and I didn't think a psycho killer was out there. I thought it was my brother and his friends trying to scare me. I turned on the back porch light and yelled some dumb insult at the door, then walked away to show them that it didn't faze me. When I went to the front of the house to see if his friend's car was there though, I got a little anxious because our driveway was fully visible from the front windows and it was empty. I even went outside and called Colton but got nothing. I locked the front door and turned around, and Millie was in the kitchen intensely staring at the back door and doing this quiet, low growl. She wasn't barking, but looked hyper-focused on it. I went to grab her, and that's when I heard my name again. What hit me next is hard to explain. I felt a wave go over my whole body from my head down. The only word that seems to fit this feeling is urgency. I would liken it to how you might feel if part of your house was on fire and you just knew you had to get out of the back door. That's the urgency I was feeling. It was like I had to go out the back door, and I was convinced that whoever was calling my name was trying to help me. So I started walking toward the door, completely ready to open it and follow the voice. Millie stepped right in front of me, barking and growling at the door and being extremely aggressive. I had never seen her act like that, and we had had her since she was 4 months old. When I reached out with my hand actually on the door handle, she sat down on my feet with all of her weight. She was such a big, heavy dog that her doing that broke me away from whatever trance or mental state I was in. Instead of opening the door, I locked it and backed away. A real terrifying fear hit me then. I had no idea who or what was outside, and I couldn't believe I was about to open the door and walk out. It still gives me chills to think I almost went outside. Millie stayed at the door for a good 5 minutes doing that same low growl the entire time and would occasionally jump up to look through the glass. I had moved over to our fireplace and was holding the metal poker with both hands, not really knowing what to do. Eventually, she either calmed down on her own or sensed that there wasn't a threat anymore, and she jumped back up on the couch. I went and sat as close to her as I possibly could and waited, still holding the poker and hoping my brother would come home. About 45 stress-filled minutes later, that finally happened and Colton's friends dropped him off. As soon as he walked in, I asked if they were the ones messing with me. He swore up and down that they hadn't done anything. They had been at the girl's house the whole time, and I believed him because even he looked worried after I told him what happened. I don't remember getting much sleep that night, but I had never been so glad my brother was there with me. He has always been this tough, brave guy that I looked up to, and he still is. I really felt safe after he got home. Even as a kid, though, I had a gut feeling it wasn't a person outside. Of course, I can't say for sure what it was, but deep down it felt like it was something else trying to get to me. That feeling I got was so crazy. I've never felt anything like it. There is no reason I should have felt an overwhelming urge to walk outside after hearing someone call my name. That's a stupid thing to do and makes no sense. I should have had the opposite reaction. Then there's Millie, who was the friendliest dog ever, but she was ready to rip someone apart. I also have to take what I saw falling out of the sky into account. Both my dad and I saw the same thing on different nights with no explanation. That seems too weird to be a coincidence. I did tell him I had seen something like he did, but never said a word about the other stuff. Back then, I was worried they'd call the police and I'd have to talk to them about what happened. I don't know why, but that scared me too, so I kept my mouth shut. I firmly believe that if Millie hadn't been there and jumped in like a dang hero, I would have walked right out the back door into who knows what. I really feel like that amazing dog saved my life. I've never really known quite how to explain my story. It's hard to understand because two things happened at once, and I'm still not sure what to think about it, but here's what happened. When I was 19, I lived in a normal neighborhood in the Midwest. On one typically hot and humid Saturday in the summer, 5 of my friends and I met up at a park we used to go to hang out and play frisbee. There was a big open grass area we would use that was in between a parking lot and a baseball field, and the rest of the park had a road and houses around it. By late afternoon, and while we were spread out in a circle and throwing the frisbee, we could see thunderheads building and started to hear thunder off and on in the distance, but it hadn't started raining yet, so we kept playing. Eventually, the wind picked up and we could see flashes of lightning and the first few drops of rain, so we all met in the center of the field to call it. I remember walking together toward our cars and talking about getting food when I noticed a static buzzing sound. It sounded like the hum from a high-voltage wire, but it got louder, and then I could feel it in my chest, and I could tell the other guys were feeling it too. Right at that second, I looked up toward the sky, and for me, it felt like time slowed down. I know this sounds insane, but I'm not exaggerating. Everything around me literally switched to slow motion. I could see my friends turning their heads. One of them was wiping his face with his shirt, and it actually looked like a slow motion replay from a football game or something on TV. Then, for just a split second, everything came to a complete stop. Every one of my friends were frozen like a still picture, and I couldn't hear a single sound around me. I didn't even have time to understand or be scared about what was happening because there was an explosive, blinding flash of light, and I felt like I got hit in the chest by a truck. Then everything went black. It wasn't like I closed my eyes or passed out. It was like I was instantly somewhere else entirely. It's hard to explain, but the darkness felt endless, like I was just suspended in this void. It was a very weird sensation. The first thing I should mention is I had no idea how long I was there. Time didn't exist to me in that space. I couldn't tell if it was seconds or hours or years. It wasn't scary, but I do remember being very confused trying to figure out where I was and what was going on. Then out of nowhere, I saw 3 large rectangles like TV or movie screens just appear right in front of me. I could see the park from above on them like a drone video or something, just hovering up in the air. I could see everything from the street and the cars parked along the road to the trees and picnic tables and even the baseball field. It was ultra sharp and clear and looked like it was in a higher definition than even real life, if that makes any sense. I looked closer at the middle screen and I could see my friends. All 5 of them were lying on the grass in the field, just flat on the ground and motionless like they'd each dropped wherever they had been standing. I still had no memory of even being in the park at this point, so what I was seeing didn't make sense to me. I kept staring at the screens and I had no idea what I was seeing or why. There was no explanation, just a quiet aerial view of the park with my friends lying there on the grass. Something else I found weird was that I wasn't panicking. I didn't feel scared or anxious about being there, and I had actually noticed that fact. Right around that moment, I could sense something else was there with me. I couldn't see anyone around, but I could feel their presence. I can only describe it as I knew it wasn't just me. Whatever was there wasn't menacing, but it felt like someone was standing behind me, only not in a physical way. As soon as I noticed I wasn't alone, whatever this was started communicating with me. But there was no voice, and I don't even want to call it telepathy. It was more like knowledge was just put directly into my mind, and the message was clear. I was safe, and I wasn't in danger. That didn't make me feel any less confused, though. If anything, it made me start to get a little uncomfortable. Not panicked, but definitely not as calm anymore. I looked back at the screens, and I noticed something had changed. I was higher in the air now, like the perspective had moved up even more, but it was still the same scene looking down at the park. Then whatever was there with me strongly communicated something else. They were here to watch us, and that was all. They didn't want to hurt us or change us or interfere with our lives in any way. They were just watching. I remember thinking to myself, what does that even mean? Who is watching us? I didn't even know who or what they were. The whole thing was so far outside of anything I'd ever experienced that I couldn't comprehend it. That's when I started yelling that I wanted to go home. At least I felt like I was yelling in my head, but I repeated it over and over that I didn't want to be there anymore. Right as I was starting to get very agitated, I looked off away from the screens and almost behind me, and I could see something moving in the dark. It was barely visible, like the only light on it was from the light coming off the screens. Whatever this was roughly shaped like a person, but also not really. Something was off and the proportions weren't right. I could see the outline, but it was more like a shadow than a solid figure. This is when I felt a real panic start to creep in, but as soon as I felt that, it communicated one last thing to me. They meant no harm and I would go back now. And in an instant, I was back, face down in the wet grass. My cheek and my open mouth were actually smashed into the field, and I could smell the rain and dirt. I remember trying to get up faster than I should have, totally lightheaded and disoriented, and I felt like I could almost hear my heart racing. I looked around and saw some of my friends getting up off the ground too. Every one of them had been down on the ground like I was. The friend who was close to me and someone I had known since grade school locked eyes with me and said, "Did that just happen?" I will always remember what I said back to him because without even thinking, I said, "I think I just met God." I don't even know why I said that, it's just what came out of my mouth. As we were getting up, my memory slowly started coming back about being at the park in the thunderstorm. A few of our friends had been farther out, and I remember seeing them walking over to us and saying that we'd all been hit. When they got to us, they said a bolt of lightning had hit the field right where I had been walking. Since they were slightly farther away, they got knocked down but didn't get knocked out like my other friend and I had been. They said it was an explosion of light and then all of us were on the ground. As soon as we were all on our feet again and checking ourselves out, this man came running across the street. He was yelling and asking if we were okay, and he said he'd seen the whole thing happen from his house across the street. His wife had already called 911, and he told us he saw the bolt hit the field and then watched all 6 of us drop to the ground. He helped us walk back to our cars, and only a few minutes after that, an ambulance and a fire truck showed up. The storm had mostly moved off at that point, so the paramedics checked us out right there on the street for a solid 30 minutes. While that was going on, a few other people had walked over to see if we were okay, and after all of it, none of us really had any injuries from what they called an indirect lightning strike. We were definitely shaken up pretty badly, especially me and the friend who was near me, but we weren't injured. Shortly after that, they told us we were okay to go home and said to come in if we had any other pain or problems, but we all got back into our cars and drove to my friend's house. When we got there, I remember feeling a little sore and maybe still a little out of it, but we spent the rest of the evening talking about what happened. None of us could believe we had all been hit by lightning. Well, indirectly anyway, but still, it was completely crazy. We did end up ordering pizzas, and being 19-year-old boys, we were already joking with each other about it by later that night. While we were eating though, I did bring up what happened to me and told them all of the details I could remember. No one else had anything like it happen. I was the only one that had any kind of experience after the lightning hit. After talking about it, we realized that only 2 of us had actually been knocked unconscious. That was me and the friend who was next to me. The other 4 had only been knocked down to the ground but stayed conscious. They were still dazed and felt like they'd been punched in the head, but they were awake the whole time. Those 4 agreed that we were all on the ground for about 15 to 20 seconds. Everybody else thought it was crazy that I'd had such a vivid and weird experience when I got knocked out, but I basically just left it at that, a weird thing that happened to me and not them for whatever reason. But later that night, after I was back at my apartment and after my girlfriend went to bed, I was on my couch alone and I couldn't stop thinking about it. While I was sitting there replaying what I'd seen, something very strange occurred to me. When I was in that dark space and looking at the aerial view of the park on those screens, I could see my 5 friends as clear as day along with every other thing around them. Like I said, it was incredibly vivid and detailed. I could see the exact positions of each of them and where they were and even how their arms and legs were laid out. What occurred to me though was that my body wasn't there. I wasn't on the ground with them. If I had had some kind of near-death experience, I should have been on the ground right next to my friend, but I wasn't anywhere. I've seen near-death stories and it seems like they always see themselves. Like they float above their own body in the hospital, or they see their body in a crushed car after a bad accident. But in my case, I clearly saw the whole scene, but my body was just gone, and it's weird that it was only mine. It made me really feel like that's not what happened to me. I am extremely lucky to have survived a lightning strike like that, even though it was indirect. But what I experienced left me forever confused. My friends still think I got hit the hardest and had some kind of unconscious dream or hallucination, but I don't know. It was nothing like a dream. It looked and felt more real than real life does, and it's something I will question for the rest of my life. I'll start my story by saying I've always felt like an odd person. Not in a weird way where I didn't have friends or couldn't fit in, but more like I've always been a little different than everyone around me. Even when I was really young, I remember thinking about things in a way that my friends didn't seem to understand. One example is, I remember finding a caterpillar crawling on a branch with two of my best friends. While they thought it was cute and cool, I could actually feel the energy from the caterpillar as I held it, and I could feel that we were connected by some larger thing. I didn't have the words for it then, but I could sense something bigger going on, and I was always aware of it. I also have what my mom used to call a disturbing lack of a fear of heights. I was the kid who would climb anything, get too close to the edges of things, and hang over balcony railings at hotels. That last one is true. I really did hang on the outside of a balcony when we were on vacation once. My mom was constantly telling me to get back from ledges or stop climbing on things, and I still don't have a problem standing at the edge of a cliff or a building and looking down. On top of everything else, I have a deep and lifelong fascination with space. I love everything related to it, and I watch SpaceX launches like they're sporting events. I don't know where it came from or why I have it, but it's strong. Whenever we start colonizing Mars and they're handing out that first round of one-way tickets, there's no question, I would go. Moving on to my story, when I was 19, my mom passed away at a young age from cancer. It was fast and we were really close, so losing her hit me hard. My parents had split up when I was a baby, and I've never had a great relationship with my dad, so once she was gone, I kind of went out on my own. I was forced to grow up fast after that, but feel like it pushed me in a positive direction. I built a career, got married, and I had kids. Life was busy with all the normal adult things until last year when I got a call from my mom's sister. She lives in Phoenix, and we're not that close other than talking occasionally on holidays and birthdays. But she called me out of the blue and said she had come across a box of my mom's stuff in her garage that had been there since her funeral. She told me there were a few personal things in it, including a large stack of her old journals, and thought I might want them. Of course I did want them, so she sent me a box of everything that showed up on my front porch about a week later. I remember waiting until my kids went to bed that night, then started flipping through the journals with a cup of tea. It was a mismatched stack of small spiral notebooks and mini hardbound booklets, along with a handful of loose pages that had been folded up. It was amazing to see her handwriting on every page with dates and little side notes from her day. There were also a lot of entries about my dad and how things were falling apart between them. It was strange hearing her talk about things like that, and very emotional. It made me feel like she was alive again and we were just talking. There was one journal, though, that went beyond anything I knew about her. This one was from a year before I was born, and she was writing about medical problems she'd been having. I won't get into it, but it was female stuff. She had seen multiple doctors, gone through a slew of testing, and eventually was told she was infertile. I had never heard any of it before that moment, and I had no idea she had gone through such a hard time before I was born. A few of the pages actually brought me to tears, where she talked about how devastating the news was and how it broke her heart. She had always wanted to be a mother, and to be told it wasn't possible crushed her. I could actually feel how alone she felt. I continued going through her journals over the next few nights, but then I got to one that had something so unexpected in it, it took me reading it twice to fully grasp what she was saying. She wrote about a night she was staying in a studio-sized guest house that was on one of her friend's parents' properties. Today we'd probably call it a tiny house. She and my dad were in the middle of one of their separations, so she had been staying there by herself. She described waking up in the middle of the night to her entire room being filled with a blinding light that was coming from outside. She talked about feeling the presence of someone or something in the room with her, and in the journal, she called them strange people. She was completely paralyzed and felt her body being taken somewhere outside of the guest house. None of this was scary to her in any way, and she makes it sound similar to an out-of-body experience where you're just watching it happen as an observer. She said that wherever they took her, there were lights and sounds around her that she couldn't explain or even remember clearly, but she did remember that something was done to her, though she emphasizes there was no pain or discomfort of any kind. When it was over, she wrote several pages about not being able to tell if it was real or a dream. Either way, it affected her enough to write it down in detail. After that bizarre section, her journal entries went completely back to normal. As I kept reading through, and from the dates, it was about a month later that she started talking about being sick all the time and feeling exhausted. Eventually, she ended up taking a pregnancy test and found out that she was pregnant with me. There were full long pages about how shocked she was and how she couldn't believe it was real, especially after being told it couldn't happen. She also referred to me as her little miracle more than once, which I had actually heard her say when I was growing up, but I never paid much attention to it or knew the backstory. I just thought it was something that Mom said. Her journals trail off not long after I was born with fewer and fewer scattered entries, then they just stop. I figure she most likely didn't have the time or energy to keep writing with a baby and work. I'm so glad she wrote as much as she did though. I feel like I got to meet a side of her that I never knew and maybe never would have known even if she were still alive today. Now that I've read everything she wrote, there's one journal I keep going back to, and it's the one from her experience in the guest house. There's something about the timing of that gives me such a weird feeling. The bright light and the strange people taking her sounds eerily like some of the abduction stories I've heard. Then miraculously, a month later she was pregnant with me after being told she couldn't have children. Now here I am. I've had a lifetime of feeling like I don't quite belong, with these deep connections to something bigger and a borderline addiction to all things space-related. I could be connecting pieces that aren't there, but it sure feels to me like whatever happened to her was real, and somehow I am the result of it. In 2012, something so crazy and unexpected happened to me that I usually have a hard time describing it. I go back and forth between it being paranormal, extraterrestrial, and even spiritual. Basically, I have no idea what it was, but it was so far outside of anything I thought was possible that I actually moved my business because of it. Here's a quick backstory about me. I run a small e-commerce business based in San Mateo, California. For years, my office was in a single-story, mixed-use corner building. There were all kinds of tenants in the building, and my office had an insurance agent on one side and an online print shop on the other. We had a small parking lot right outside our front door that wrapped around the side of the building, and all of our offices faced a three-way intersection. Back then, I was still grinding to grow my business, so anytime we had a heavy day of orders, I would be the one to stay late after my 3 employees went home to make sure products were packed and ready to be picked up by UPS in the morning. It was very normal for me to be there until midnight on these days, sometimes later. On one of these late nights, I was leaving right before 1 o'clock in the morning. I had just shut everything down, turned the lights off, and was standing at our main door that went out to the parking lot. I clearly remember noticing how foggy it had gotten outside. It was summer, so that wasn't uncommon, but it did make everything outside really quiet. I locked the door, turned around toward my car, and that's when I saw a man standing in the middle of the intersection right under the traffic lights. He was wearing all black, and at that hour, with every other office closed and not a single car in the lot except mine, it immediately put me on high alert. I kept my eyes glued to him as I walked to my car and figured worst case scenario, if he tried anything or ran toward me, I could sprint back into my office and lock the door. But he didn't move. He just stood completely still right in the middle of the intersection. As soon as I made it to my car, I felt better, but there was one problem. The three-way intersection was the only way out of that entire business complex that my building was in. There was no back exit or alternate road. I had to go right through where this guy was standing. I told myself he was either homeless or on drugs, and I could just drive around him if I needed to. I backed out of my parking spot, making my headlights shine directly toward him, so he had to know I was there. The heavy fog made this whole scene even sketchier, by the way. Then, right when I put it into drive to leave, this guy's body lifted vertically straight off the ground. He fully levitated into the air. This was no David Blaine street magic trick. He went high. This isn't an exaggeration. He had to be at least 6 feet above the road, then stayed there in one spot in the air. I don't care who you are, when you see something like this alone and at 1 o'clock in the morning, you lose any cool you think you might have. My stomach felt like it dropped out of me. Any thoughts I had earlier about getting mugged or attacked, all of it was gone. It was so far from anything I could comprehend that for a second I couldn't move. I remember gripping my steering wheel so hard it hurt my hands, and then I hit the gas. I bounced over the curb on accident and heard the underside of my car scrape all the way down the passenger's side. Then I turned out of the lot and had no other choice but to head straight through the intersection. Right when I turned the corner and looked ahead, he was gone. There was nobody in the road or in the air. It was just an empty, foggy intersection with streetlights. As I started to drive through it, a deep glow turned on like a light switch, and it dimly lit the whole intersection. I wouldn't call it bright, but it was enough to cast a light down on the road and on my car. I couldn't help myself, and I leaned forward over the steering wheel to look up through the windshield, only to see the scariest and most unnatural thing I could ever imagine. Above me in the fog, I could see a huge circular glow like it was the bottom of something larger. It was easily the same size as the intersection, maybe bigger, and like silhouettes against that huge light were at least 6 other dark figures hovering, maybe 25 feet above the ground. None of them were moving. They all looked like they were just stuck there. When I saw this, it broke me. I pushed the gas pedal so hard it felt like my foot might go through the floorboard. I no longer cared about the light or the floating figures or even the possibility of other cars on the road. I just needed to get away. As I blasted down the street, I was fixed on my rearview mirror more than where I was going and could see that the intersection was still lit up. Then just a second later, that light shut off and I could only see the empty intersection. My entire body was visibly shaking and I couldn't even put thoughts together. This sounds stupid, but I was seriously convinced the rapture was happening because it was so unexplainable, and I'm not even religious. I've never driven faster in my life, and after getting home, I sat in my locked car and in the garage for what had to be 30 minutes. There was just no explanation for what had happened, and I was shocked down to my core. That night changed me on a fundamental level, and I felt like I didn't know what was real anymore. I'm really not trying to be this dramatic, it just flows out of me like this when I think about it and talk about it. After experiencing this, I never stayed late or alone at that office again. For months, if we had a busy day, I'd either let the orders go until morning or load up my car and finish them at home, bringing everything back early the next day. I couldn't physically be there alone, and it actually turned into a phobia. About 4 months after it happened, I found another office space in a much busier area and moved my business. It might sound like overkill, but I didn't want to be there anymore. For a full week after this happened, I didn't say a word about anything, but I realized I couldn't keep it in and I spilled it all to my girlfriend at the time. She was supportive but quiet and didn't have much to say about it, not that I blame her. Once I had said it out loud to her, it was easier to also tell my longtime friend and first employee, Jamie. He believed everything I said and leaned into it being something supernatural. We talked about it being something extraterrestrial too, and I guess that would be what I feel fits best. I don't really believe in ghosts and hauntings, so maybe that's why. The only thing I can say is that it changed my understanding of reality. It almost hurts my brain to think back and know that it actually happened. I saw this thing happen right in front of me. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with that. My entire life has been completely normal other than this one giant thing, and if anything, I feel more confused about it now than when it happened. When I was a kid, between about 8 and 12 years old, I had what I thought were recurring dreams. I used to sleep on the top bunk in a room I shared with my older brother Justin. From the top bunk, I had a view of our backyard, and I could see pretty far across our neighbor's land behind us since our room was on the second floor. The dreams always started with me lying in my bed at night, looking out the window like I usually did to fall asleep, and I would see this thing floating in the distance. It was shaped like an egg and dark, and it would slowly come toward our house until I couldn't see it anymore, but I always somehow knew it was hovering directly above the roof. As soon as I would lose sight of it, two beings would come into my room. As a kid, I called them ghosts because they looked similar to people, but I remember them being very thin with light skin and dark eyes. They would also come through the window, like through the actual glass as if it wasn't even there. When they came in, they would talk to me, but not out loud or in the normal sense. I just knew what they were saying in my head. None of this ever scared me, and I would just lay there on my side looking at them and quietly answering their questions. I don't remember exactly what they would ask me, but I remember always answering. Over the 4 years this was happening, there were 3 separate times that I went somewhere with them. All 3 times it was the same place, which was a circular room, and it always reminded me of what the inside of a soup can looks like, but bigger. I wasn't forced, but strongly encouraged to stand on a small platform in this room and answer more questions. I never saw who I was talking to, but I could feel that something else was there. Again, none of this was threatening, and I don't ever remember feeling scared or in danger, but it did feel important, like what I said mattered. As soon as I had my 12th birthday, everything completely stopped, and I never had another dream or experience. Weirdly, I didn't even think much about it after it stopped. I just grew up and forgot about it, and I am now 42 years old. Moving forward in time, last year my mom was diagnosed with dementia. She was still in the same house we grew up in, but had been there alone since my dad died in 2022. With her disease, taking care of the house and the property were getting to be too much for her, so Justin and I convinced her to rent out the house and move into an apartment in town where she still lives today. While we were helping her transition into the apartment, Justin and I were moving a truck full of her stuff into a storage unit, and I found a box filled with our old school stuff. This was art projects, Christmas ornaments we had made, awards, and things like that. I started going through it and found a manila envelope full of drawings I had made when I was in elementary school. There were dozens of pages, and every one of them was a different depiction of the dreams I was having back then. There were drawings of the egg-shaped object floating above our house and the 2 figures standing by the window, and a few of me standing on that platform in the round room. They were all signed by me in the bottom corner, which I'm glad I did because I honestly had no memory of drawing any of them. A day or 2 after I found them, I was going over to my mom's, and I guess I just wanted to know more, so I brought the envelope with me and asked her. Her memory comes and goes, but she tends to do much better with older memories, and she recognized the drawings as soon as I pulled them out. She said those years were kind of a big deal, and that she and my dad had been really worried about me. I guess she would find the drawings in my binder from school and up in my room, and I apparently talked about the dreams all the time back then. They had even planned on taking me to a doctor or a psychiatrist, but when I turned 12, it stopped, so they never did anything about it. Then she told me an additional side story that I had never heard before and knew nothing about. During that same summer when I turned 12, we had a family reunion at our house, which I absolutely remember because a cousin I didn't get to see much came. He lived in North Carolina, but we were only a few months apart in age, so I was always closer to him than any of my other cousins. At some point during the reunion, my aunt had taken a picture of my mom and dad standing with my brother and me on the side of the house. My mom said she loved it because we were all smiling, but when my aunt sent us a larger print of it, my mom noticed something in the picture behind us. What she initially thought was perfect timing on my aunt's part for catching a large bird coming down to land on top of a big tree behind us actually looked like a dark oval-shaped object in the sky when you looked at it closely. She told me it was always hard to tell exactly what it was because my aunt had used a semi-professional camera with a portrait lens, and the picture of us had shallow depth of field, which made everything behind us out of focus. My mom never jumped to any conclusions, but she did say it was an unsettling coincidence since I had been having dreams about that exact object over our house. She said she never framed the photo or put it out, so it kind of floated around our house as a loose print for decades. It wasn't in the box that we found, and I wasn't able to find it in any of the other stuff we moved into storage, so I'm guessing it got lost somewhere over the years. The conversation I had with her about the family photo, on top of finding my old drawings, has really consumed me. I've been trying really hard to remember more from that time, and I hope I can find the family photo because I feel like I need to see it now. I also had no idea my parents were going to take me to see someone for what I thought was no big deal. I never thought it was anything anyone cared about back then. I don't know what was actually happening to me, but I would be lying if I said I don't look at the dreams differently now. The fact that I documented everything as a kid without even remembering doing it is just crazy to me, and it tells me that what I went through meant a lot more to me at the time than I remember. In the summer of 2020, right in the middle of COVID, I was living in a rental house that my uncle owned in a pretty backwoods neighborhood in Arkansas. Right across a gravel road from me was my neighbor Jeff and his family, and from my living room window I had a perfect view of the front of their house and their front yard. Jeff and his wife Donna were always nice to me, and I had been to dozens of barbecues and football game parties at their house. I had also had countless chats with Jeff in the yard and in the driveway when we were both outside at the same time. He is as much of a redneck as a person could be, so talking with him was never boring. I want to mention all of that because I really like both of them, but they're also the kind of people that you could call rough around the edges. They are loud. Their two kids are even louder, and they're not shy about having arguments out in the open. It didn't matter if they were in the house cooking breakfast or out in the front yard at midnight, it wasn't uncommon to hear them yelling at each other from across the street at any time, day or night. There was never any kind of violence between them, and they definitely loved each other. They just liked to argue as hard as they liked to party. One random weeknight, I had just finished eating after work and I was on my couch watching TV. I don't know what time it was, but probably around 10 o'clock when I heard the familiar sound of them arguing across the street. They were outside of their house, and since my windows were wide open, I could hear that it had something to do with the cost of one of their kids' braces. Then that escalated into personal jabs about who worked harder. I'm not proud of it, but I'm human, and I lifted one of the blinds to watch without anybody seeing me. It's not that I was trying to spy on them, but when a couple is shouting at each other right outside your window, it's hard not to look. They had started in the driveway and then moved their way out to the front yard, and right as they were standing face to face in their yard, I felt and heard this low vibration go all the way through my house. I turned around to look back at my living room, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then as soon as I looked back out the front window, I saw Jeff and Donna standing perfectly still in this intense light. I was at a total loss for words because I had no idea what was going on. It looked exactly like they were standing in a bright spotlight on a concert stage, and the light was going all the way around them, but not anywhere else. Neither one of them were moving either. They were both completely frozen and just staring at each other mid-argument. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It really startled me so much that I dropped to the floor and crawled away from the window to my kitchen. From behind my kitchen counter, I could still see the light coming through the cracks in my blinds, but I didn't hear a plane or helicopters or anything that could explain what was happening. After what felt like an eternity, but was only seconds, I'm sure, the light shut off and it was dark outside again. Genuinely worried about my neighbors, I walked back to the window and pulled the blinds all the way open, but there was nothing there. My neighbors weren't standing in their yard, and I couldn't see or hear anything. The entire neighborhood was dead quiet, like nothing had even happened. I could still see the lights on in their house, which was a good sign, but it left me more confused than I think I've ever been about anything. I didn't know what to think or do about it, so I watched for another 10 or 15 minutes, then locked up my windows and doors and spent a good portion of the night awake in my room. The next morning when I was getting ready, everything outside seemed normal. Jeff's truck was gone like he had left for work, and Donna's car was sitting in the driveway. I went to work too, but it was the only thing I could think about all day. I work at a glass company, and while I was installing a shower door with a guy I've known forever, I told him every detail. His best guess was that they had put in a motion-sensing floodlight, and I had seen it go on when they walked out into the front yard. I was actually impressed by that guess, to be totally honest, but there is no chance that it was right because a floodlight would have spread out over the lawn. This light was perfectly around the two of them, and like I said, it looked exactly like a light you'd see aimed at someone singing on a stage. That following weekend, I was mowing my lawn when Jeff walked over to say hi. We talked about whatever for a few minutes, then I couldn't help myself and I told him as casually as I could that I had seen something weird in their yard the other night. When he asked me what it was, I was straight with him, even though I felt stupid saying it, and I admitted that I had seen them arguing out in the yard and watched them freeze in place under a bright spotlight. The first thing he did was laugh and look at me like I was messing with him. Then I think he could tell I wasn't joking, and he said he had no idea what I was talking about. He was dead serious when he said it too. I really didn't want to be awkward, but I told him a second time that I had seen them in the front yard together, then saw a bright spotlight shining directly down on them. I could see the blank look on his face immediately. He had no clue. I also asked if he put up a floodlight somewhere on the house or out in the yard, and he told me that he hadn't done anything like that. I didn't want to make things weird, so I brushed it off and I told him I must have dreamt it. And then we moved back to a normal conversation, but I was barely there mentally for the rest of the time we were talking. I came to the conclusion that he must have had a few too many that night and just didn't remember what had happened. That still didn't clear anything up for me though. Months later in the fall, I was over at their house with a bunch of other people for a barbecue. I happened to catch Donna alone for a second in their kitchen and I finally brought it up to her, which I had been waiting for the right time to do. I didn't get too personal and tell her I saw them arguing. I only told her the part about feeling what I thought was a small earthquake, then looking out of the window and seeing the two of them standing perfectly still under some kind of spotlight from my living room window. She looked even more confused than Jeff had when I told him. Then she said it must have been other people in their yard because it wasn't them. She also said that they hadn't felt any kind of vibration or shaking either. Just like when I told Jeff, I could tell she honestly didn't have a clue. I dropped it after her reaction, and that was the last thing I ever said about it to either one of them. I never got any kind of explanation, and I don't think I would ever bring it up to them again. They aren't really the type of people to talk about things like this, and I still feel weird about mentioning it the first time. I am positive I saw what I saw, but now it's just this mystery event, and I'm the only one who knows about it. Something really weird happened to them in the yard, and even though they don't have any memory of it, I watched it happen with my own eyes. This is going to sound like sleep paralysis, but it happened to 3 different people on 3 separate occasions, all in the same room and years apart, so you couldn't convince me that something real wasn't going on. The first person happened to be me. My parents had a spare bedroom in a new house they had just built. The room was basically a copy of the master, but it was on the opposite end of the house and away from everything else. I think it was technically called a mother-in-law suite, but it was perfect for guests or whoever wanted more privacy than one of the normal bedrooms. I happened to be visiting my parents and staying in the room shortly after the house was finished and before they had even gotten the landscaping in. On the very first night, I woke up at some point to flashing green and blue lights right outside the window. I actually thought the police were there when I first opened my eyes, but then I realized the colors were wrong for it to be any kind of law enforcement or first responder. All I wanted to do was get to the window to see what was going on, but when I tried to get up, I felt completely paralyzed. It was like a full body paralysis too, where I could only move my eyes to look around, but nothing else. I'm not one to panic or freak out in tense situations, but I've never felt anything like that, and it was a horrible and extremely claustrophobic feeling. The next part is very weird and happened almost in an instant. I could feel my consciousness, not my body, being ripped out of the bed and pulled from the house in a very fast and aggressive way. I was all of a sudden outside and above that part of the house, and I could see the entire side of it being lit up. Then I was immediately pulled back into the bed. The last thing I remember was looking down and seeing this very thin figure standing at the bottom right-hand side of the bed and then screaming as loud as I possibly could. Then I just woke up in the bed and it was noon the next day. What's crazy to me is that my ex-wife had been sleeping in the bed next to me during all of it, and she didn't see or hear anything, not even me yelling at what felt like the top of my lungs. It was a disturbing experience and it stuck with me for most of that day, but I basically told myself it was just a vivid nightmare and that was it. About 2 years after that, I went up to my parents' house again for a family weekend, and I got there right when they were eating lunch. I hadn't even been there long enough to unload my car when my brother, who had gotten there the day before me, came bursting out of that same spare bedroom. His eyes were bloodshot and he was yelling at my mom and dad, asking them how they could have let this happen. He and I have never been very close, and I hate to say this about my brother, but he's kind of an all-around jackass to most people. So when he was yelling at them, I stepped in and put my hands on his chest, and then he looked right past me and literally screamed at them, "You let them take me." The second he said that, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I got him to sit down and cool off, and then I asked him what had happened. He spewed out an identical experience to the one I had had 2 years earlier. He had seen the lights outside of the spare room exactly like I did, then was paralyzed, then was pulled outside against his will by what he called a shadow. The only difference was that when he was being pulled out of the room, it was slow and he had gone right past my parents in the living room. He said he was desperately shouting to them for help, but they didn't even look and completely ignored him as this thing took him away. In the moment, I told him it was just a nightmare and that everything was fine, which did get him to snap out of it a little and accept that that's what it was. But later that morning, I pulled him aside and told him my story and how the exact same thing had happened to me when I was staying in that room. Like I said, we were never that close, but I could tell it had affected him, and I think we were sort of bonded over the shared experience. We also couldn't understand how it was possible for both of us to have almost identical nightmares in the same room and 2 years apart. The whole thing was just weird. About 3 years after my brother's experience, and in 2015, my nephew was turning 10 years old, and my sister was having his birthday party at our parents' house. They had let him and 2 of his friends stay in the guest bedroom that weekend during the party. On the morning of the party, he woke up screaming for my sister. But I guess she ran into the room and he was sitting all the way up against the headboard of the bed and completely freaking out while the other 2 boys were standing there panicked because they didn't know what was wrong with him. It was a horribly embarrassing thing for him, and my sister says it really put a damper on the party because he was not himself that day. Obviously curious about it because of what happened to me, I asked if she had talked to him about what happened, which she had, and sure enough, he had seen the lights outside, then felt paralyzed, then said he was pulled out of the house just like my brother and I had been. He also saw something standing at the foot of the bed, but in his experience, he got a much more clear view of it and said it had gray skin and black eyes. He told her that it was trying to take him somewhere he didn't want to go, and that's why he had been screaming for her. She told me it was a very traumatic thing for him, and it took him a long time to get past it. Nothing has happened since that birthday party, which was 10 years ago. I find it impossible that 3 of us, all in the same family, have had almost the exact same experience in that room. I don't care if you want to say that's a coincidence, a dream, or something paranormal, but it's the creepiest thing I've ever heard of. Another weird observation is that it's only happened to the males in our family. Me, my brother, and my nephew. My sister and my aunt and my mom's friend have all stayed in there dozens of times over the years without anything happening. If anything, it's the opposite with them, and they love having the guest room when they visit. I personally haven't slept in there since the first time, and I know my brother doesn't stay in there either. When I go to their house now, I just sleep on the couch in front of the TV. There's one last thing I want to mention about it, and this could be related or not. When my parents were building the house, there was a giant oak tree directly outside the window of the guest room. They had made it a point to be careful and keep it during construction because the thing was like 200 years old. That tree lived for a few years and seemed just fine, but out of nowhere, it died with no explanation. My parents had a tree company come out to remove it, and even they didn't know why it had died. I know the construction could have put a strain on it, or maybe some of the roots had been cut when they were excavating, but it's just one more part to the overall story that I find so weird. When I was 12 years old, my family bought a small fishing cabin on a river about 70 miles from our house in Lewiston, Idaho. It was a pretty backwoods area with only dirt roads and scattered cabins on the river. The cabin itself was basic and older, but nice at the same time because it had a summer camp vibe. It was close enough to the river that we could hear the water, but you had to take a short trail to actually get down there to fish. I think it was only our second or third time staying there, but one weekend we had gone for more of a work trip. My parents were painting inside and my dad was repairing and replacing screens in all the windows. I have an older sister and 2 younger brothers, so it was all 6 of us helping and working, but in between that, we did still have time to fish and wander around in the woods. On the very first morning, I was helping my dad outside and a woman walked over to see who had bought the cabin and say hi. She was probably in her 60s and really nice and said she lived full-time in the next house down the river from us with her husband. I wasn't paying attention while she was talking to my parents, but before she left, she specifically told my sister and I not to be scared if we saw strange things out there at night because it was normal and we should feel safe. It was an awkward thing for her to say and she was dead serious when she said it, but the 2 of us actually started snickering because it felt like she was talking about monsters in the woods or something. My mom apologized for us, then later gave us an earful about being rude to the neighbor. On our last full day there, the 4 of us kids walked down to go night fishing with our dad. We took flashlights but kept them off most of the time because the stars were incredible. My dad was especially good at pointing out constellations and he loved showing us how and where to find them. After we had been fishing for a while, my youngest brother randomly pointed out a perfect circle of stars overhead and he asked what constellation it was. We all looked up at the same time, but my dad said it wasn't a constellation because they were way too low and no constellation is in a circle like that. Every light in this circle was completely still, just like stars would be, so to me it really did look like a constellation, but I remember watching my dad put his rod down on the ground and he actually walked into the water with his shoes on to see it better. While he was in the river and looking up, he told us to grab our stuff and head back to the cabin. As we were grabbing everything, I remember my dad's voice yelling, "Oh my God," which obviously startled all of us. Then he said the circle of lights had broken apart and each one had gone off in a different direction. None of us had seen it because we were getting our fishing gear, but after it happened, his entire personality changed and he yelled at us to leave everything and go back to the cabin, which we did in a hurry. Without thinking, we took off running up the trail. I was at the back of the line behind my sister and 2 brothers, and I remember briefly looking back at my dad where I saw him leaning down and picking up our stuff. I also remember being extremely worried about leaving him there. At about the halfway point, I stopped because my conscience kept telling me to go back and help him. I was definitely scared, but I was more worried about him, and I did start to walk back down toward the river. As soon as I got close to the water, I saw all of our gear scattered on the ground right where the trail started. It looked like he had just thrown everything down all at once, and it gave me this horrible feeling that something happened to him. I hate to admit it, but at that age, I didn't have the courage to walk all the way down to see if he was okay, so I started walking back up the hill again. On the way up, I ran into my sister and brothers who had also stopped because they were wondering where I went. I told them exactly what had happened and that I didn't know where our dad was, so all 4 of us started calling his name. We called him dozens of times over several minutes and didn't hear a single answer back. Finally, we heard someone running up the trail, then saw that it was him coming. In just seconds, he was up where we were, and he sprinted right past us without saying a word. I don't even think he looked at us, he just ran straight to the cabin. We all followed him, then when we got to the top, he was standing inside the back door and waving for us to come inside. He really looked angry and just told us to go in our rooms and go to bed, and he said it in a way where we knew he meant it, so we did exactly that and got into our bunks without asking questions. All I could do was lay there and try to sleep while being so confused about what had just happened. It also dawned on me that he left our fishing gear at the river because he wasn't carrying anything when he ran past us. After a pretty sleepless night, the next morning got even weirder. My sister tried to bring it up first thing and he cut her off right away. The only thing he said, and this was with my mom standing right there, was that he had to cut our night fishing short because he had gotten too tired. That was his whole explanation. None of it made sense to me, and it was a very weird and disturbing way to see one of your parents act. I have never seen my otherwise normal father act like that even one time before that trip or after it. Something had obviously rattled him, he just wouldn't admit it or talk about it. The craziest part is that we never went to the cabin again. That was our last trip ever. My parents never even talked to us about it or told us anything, and the few times we asked about it or wanted to go, they would brush it off and say we couldn't afford it. After 2 years, they suddenly decided to sell it, and that was it. Over the years and as an adult, I've brought it up to my dad maybe 2 times. He always shuts it down immediately though, and he's just not a guy you want to piss off by prying, so I stopped asking about it. I wish I knew what happened to him, but he's apparently going to take it to his grave. I can't imagine what could have made him act like that though. I still think that it has to be related to the circle of lights we saw, but part of me also wonders if the neighbors were freaks and somehow threatened him while he was alone. I still think it was weird for that lady to say what she did. I really have no idea, and unfortunately, it'll most likely stay a mystery unless my dad decides to come clean, but I don't see that happening. This is a story my dad has told me since I was a kid, and it's something I have never forgotten. Actually, I've heard it so many times that I feel like I can tell it just as accurately as he can. In 1977 and before I was born, my dad was out backpacking with 3 of his buddies in Colorado. They were in their early 20s at the time, all very outdoorsy guys, and they had planned a multi-day trip up in the mountains. On the first day, they hiked the longest part, which took up most of the daylight hours and was all uphill. They had gained a ton of altitude and eventually topped out on the first section and came to a wide alpine field that stretched out in every direction. It was getting close to sunset, and just before they started to think about setting up camp, they passed through a massive field full of bighorn sheep. He says at a minimum there were several dozen of them, but it could have been closer to 100 if they had been able to see farther down the hill. He says it was surreal how many there were because you don't normally see that many in one place, and they were all calmly grazing, not even paying attention to them hiking through the field. They actually took it as a good sign and kept going until they found a flat area just past the field where they figured they'd camp for the night. It was a high camp at just below 12,000 feet and right near Rawlins Pass. They were looking forward to a sight like that though because they wanted a huge, wide-open view of the stars. After they set up the tents, they got a fire going and sat around enjoying the quiet. They were passing drinks around and swapping backcountry stories like you do on those kind of trips, but it had mostly been spooky or weird things that had happened on other hikes. Right in the middle of their conversation, the entire sky above them lit up like it was daytime. It was so bright that my dad said he actually had to squint and throw his hand in front of his face to try and see what was going on. They all looked up and saw a huge fireball coming down through the sky. It wasn't ripping through the atmosphere like you'd think a meteorite would. It was falling, and it was falling slowly enough that they had time to react and jump up to their feet. As soon as they were standing, the fireball fell behind the next ridge closest to them, and it must have slammed into the ground because there was a massive boom that echoed through the canyon. My dad says it was so loud they felt a physical shock wave and heard the sound of small loose rocks moving and falling afterward. As you'd imagine, they all went crazy thinking they'd seen an actual meteorite hit the earth. It was scary and exciting and shocking all at the same time, and what made it even crazier was that they had just been telling strange wilderness stories, and then in the middle of talking about it, they had this totally unexpected and rare event happen. One of the guys, Whit, who was the kind of guy you'd call an adrenaline junkie today, immediately wanted to hike all the way over there and check it out with flashlights. He was the kind of guy that wouldn't think twice about doing something like that, even if it meant hiking across a sketchy ridgeline in the dark. But my dad and the other two proposed the safer alternative of hiking over to it in the daylight the next morning, and they convinced Whit to hold out for the night. There's no denying they were all buzzing about it though, and needless to say, none of them slept much that night. As soon as the sun popped up above the horizon, they were up and packing. They broke down camp fast and didn't even bother with breakfast, then hiked over the ridge and toward the direction where they thought the fireball had hit. It was just beyond Roland's Pass, but still a decent hike with a lot of scrambling. Whit had been in the lead, of course, but he was a seasoned climber and mountaineer, so it made sense for him to find the best route over the ridge without a trail. When they finally made it to the top of the ridge, thinking it had to be just on the other side, Whit was the first one over. My dad watched him take the last steps to the top, then saw him stop dead in his tracks and just stand there staring. Then Whit turned around with this look on his face that my dad says he will never forget. It was pure shock, and not in a good way, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. My dad literally sprinted up the last 50-foot stretch to catch up with Whit, and when he crested the top and looked down, he understood immediately. There was a huge section of field just below them that was covered in bighorn sheep, but every one of them was dead. My dad and his friends dropped their packs on the ridge and ran down to get a better look, and there were dozens of bighorns scattered around everywhere. Some were intact, and some were nothing but limbs, bones, and other unidentifiable pieces. He says it looked like something had just ripped through the entire herd. They kept walking around expecting to find an impact crater or a giant burned area or some sign of the explosion they had all heard. If a meteorite had hit the ground and taken out a whole herd of large animals, there should have been some serious evidence of it, or at least an obvious patch of charred ground, but they didn't find a thing. He says they spread out and wandered around the field for over an hour, completely baffled. Whit had the only half-plausible idea that if it had been a meteorite, it could have possibly exploded in the air just above the ground, which might have affected the sheep but not the ground. While that made some sense, you would expect some kind of debris or disturbance on the ground, and there wasn't any. Not that they could find anyway. They ended up finishing the trip, but every minute of it was spent discussing what had happened. Every break, every meal, and every step of trail, they were talking about it, and none of them knew what to think. Even now, they still don't. My dad sees Whit at least a couple of times a year, and he's been like an uncle to me since I was born. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard them talking about this story. When I was young, it really used to scare me, but now I'm more curious than anything else. I so wish they would have reported it to someone so that at least a ranger might have gone up there to check it out. I also wish one of them had brought a camera so there were pictures. I guess I'm so close to the story that I feel like I want answers as much as my dad and his friends do. I've never been to Colorado, and I'm not even close to the hiker my dad was, but it is on my bucket list to someday hike to that same spot and see it for myself. I'm sure it looks completely normal after 40 years, but I'd still like to stand there and imagine what it must have been like. I have a very odd memory from my childhood that in my head I've always referred to as the waving man. I can't remember how old I was when it started, but it went on for a while, then quit happening in my early teenage years. I'm now an old man and happily retired, but I still have a clear memory of it. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota. I have many fond memories of those days, and my family was always doing something on the weekends, no matter the weather. Whenever we would take weekend trips, my dad liked to leave on a Friday night after work to get as much time as possible out of his days off. The memory I'm talking about would only happen occasionally, but when it did, it was at night and right as we were leaving for a weekend trip. I would be in the back seat of the car looking out the window and excited to be going somewhere, mostly just watching the world go by, and then within 10 minutes of leaving our house, I would see a dark figure standing on the side of the road ahead of us. I'll refer to this figure as a man for the story, but it never looked like a man to me because it had a very strange, unhuman shape to it. As we would get closer, I would watch the figure raise his arm up as if he were casually waving at me as we drove past him. I would stare out the window as we went by, only separated by a sheet of glass and a few feet, and I even remember seeing him turn his head to follow our car like he was looking right at me, but I could never see his face or any details. Then we would just keep driving. I did tell my parents more than once about it, and I even tried to point it out once as we drove by, but they could never see anything, and they would tell me I was seeing trees and branches in the woods that just so happened to look like a person in the dark. There are 2 reasons I never believed that. 1, I clearly saw this man and was wide awake staring at him just feet from our car. And 2, this went on until my early teen years, so I wasn't some sleepy 4-year-old dreaming it up in the back seat. I wouldn't say I was terrified of him, but I wouldn't have wanted my dad to stop the car either. It was more of an unnerving feeling because I didn't know what it was, and like I said before, right around the time I hit my teenage years, I stopped seeing him. Many years later, when I had kids of my own and my parents were still alive, I brought it up to my mom. I told her I remembered seeing this man dozens of times when we would be leaving at night on a trip, and that he would put his arm up like he was waving at me every single time. Neither she nor my dad ever saw anyone like that, and again told me I was young and seeing things in the woods that resembled a person. I wasn't going to argue about it with my aging mother, but I still knew I hadn't been seeing things. Not to mention, it would happen in different locations and on different roads depending on where we were going. Even more decades passed. My wife and I raised 2 kids, my parents passed away, and I retired. We also bought a lake house on Devil Track Lake, which is 2 hours northeast of Duluth. This was supposed to be our home away from home and where my wife and I would live full-time during the summers. I pictured fishing, relaxing, and having the kids and grandkids stay with us. Basically, it was the retirement my wife and I had dreamed of and worked our whole lives to be able to afford. During our very first summer there, this was last summer, 2024, everything was perfect and I couldn't have asked for anything more. Then, on Saturday night, September 7th, I was outside covering my wife's garden because the temperature was supposed to dip down to freezing. During the 2 short minutes I was outside, I saw the most incredible shooting star streak across the sky. I called it a fireball because it looked like one being so low in the sky. It crossed half the sky burning up, then it fizzled out as it got even lower, but after the fire went out, I could still see a darker shape keep falling like a chunk of it had made it through the atmosphere intact. Then that piece looked like it actually hit the ground somewhere in the woods behind us to the north. It was an unbelievable thing to see, and I could swear I even heard it while it was coming down. My only thought was meteorite, and I felt lucky to have seen it. I told my wife about it, but other than that, we went to bed shortly after I saw it. The next night, I was driving back down to Duluth for 2 days to stay at our house and do a mail check, then drop off a coffee table I had refurbished for my son. It had just gotten dark when I left the lake house, and yes, I like to do longer drives at night like my dad did. About a mile from our driveway, there's a bend in the road where the woods are on the left side and the other lake houses and driveways are on the right. When I came around that corner, only going about 25 miles an hour, I had to do a double take because there was a man standing on the left side of the road. I slowed down to probably 15 miles an hour to make sure he wasn't trying to cross. Then, as I rounded the corner, I could see with absolute certainty it was the same exact dark figure from when I was young, the waving man. This sent the chill of all chills through me, and purely on reflex and adrenaline, I put the gas pedal to the floor. Almost in slow motion, my truck accelerated past him, giving me just enough time to see him raise his arm like he was waving at me. I'm normally a slow driver, but I didn't take my foot off the pedal until way down the road where there's a little general store and campground. I didn't just feel fear, it was a weird combination of memories and fear. Something I had almost forgotten about suddenly jumped back into my life, and I got this feeling like he had been waiting for me. I drove all the way down to the highway with the tightest grip on the steering wheel, and I was trying so hard to focus on the center line and not the sides of the road. When I finally hit the highway, I called my son because even though I couldn't remember even telling him the story, the two of us are very close and I knew he would take me seriously. I also just wanted to talk to someone. After spending 2 days at our house in Duluth and seeing my kids, I decided to leave in the morning to come home. I didn't want to be driving at night again. Even when I got back to the lake in the middle of the day, I was still nervous and anxious coming down our road. I was almost sure I would see him somewhere again, but I made it to the house without incident. I had a long, in-depth talk with my wife that afternoon. She knew the story from my childhood, but I felt like whatever it was had come back. I even confessed to her that I'd given it the Waving Man nickname. Because I am so sure this man I am seeing is not an actual person, my mind leans towards something paranormal. A ghost or a spirit, or maybe even a guardian angel of sorts, since he only seems to show up before a trip. But if that were the case, I would have to wonder why he only presents himself in the form of a disturbingly dark and featureless figure. My wife brought up something else while we were talking. She reminded me about the meteorite or fireball that came down just one night before seeing the man, and she wondered if the two things could have anything to do with each other. I hadn't put them together like that, and I still don't know if I would, but I agree with her that it is a very strange coincidence, and I did see that chunk of it keep going after the initial bright streak, so I suppose there could be something there. Since last September, things have been back to normal, but I think about it every time I drive down our road. I also won't drive at night unless my wife is with me. Call me a coward, but I don't want to see him again when I'm alone. I still love our lake house, but I feel slightly on edge when we're there now. There's an underlying nervousness and I feel like I'm being watched. I can also tend to get into my own head and swear I'll see something in the trees or at the end of our driveway even though I'm sure there's nothing there, or almost sure. I don't like to say this, but I am convinced it's just a matter of time before I see him again. My name is Cassidy, or Cass for short. I was born and raised in Vermont in an A-frame home back in the trees like something out of a postcard. My parents are what most people would call hippies or naturalists, but I call them normal. They grew a lot of the food we ate, so we were always picking vegetables, herbs, and berries, and we had a small orchard of apple and pear trees that my dad planted before I was born. We also had chickens and a few rabbits. Everything about life in that house felt tied to the land, and my parents loved living off-grid before it was cool. I was also homeschooled until high school and spent just as much time outside learning about the world from my parents as I did with books at the kitchen table. Weeding the gardens, collecting eggs, helping my dad change the oil in his truck. Those were all normal parts of growing up for me, and it was the best childhood I could have asked for. It's the kind that more kids need today. That was the backdrop for something that happened to me on the night of my 8th birthday. It had been a fun day of having friends over and playing games outside, along with cake and gifts and the usual birthday traditions. When it was over and after I'd gone upstairs for the night, I was sitting up in bed with a coloring book on my knees and I heard someone calling my name from downstairs. At least that's what it sounded like, but it didn't sound like my mom or dad. The voice was higher and very clear, and I was sure that I heard my name. I climbed out of bed and walked downstairs. Our A-frame had a big open front section with huge windows going all the way up to the ceiling, and I slept up in the loft part of the house while my parents were in the one downstairs bedroom that was next to the kitchen. When I was coming down the stairs, I realized the voice calling me wasn't even inside. It was coming from outside in front of the house. I remember looking out the windows, and since the moon had been bright that night, I could see one of our rabbits sitting in the front yard. It just so happened to be my favorite rabbit, the one I loved the most and had named Mr. Rabbit. This is going to sound weird, but when I saw him out there, I connected him with the voice I was hearing, like he was the one calling me. I know how it sounds to say that, but at that age, it felt oddly natural, like of course Mr. Rabbit would call me if he needed my help. All I could think of was that he had gotten out somehow and needed me to open the door so he could come inside where it was safe. Without any hesitation, I pulled the front door wide open, looking at him the whole time. then stepped down our 2 wooden steps and walked barefoot onto the cold grass. The instant my feet felt the temperature difference, something shifted in my thought process, and I suddenly knew that it had not been my rabbit calling my name. In reality, he wasn't even outside. About 20 feet in front of me, where the edge of the grass stopped at the trees, I saw 3 child-sized figures about the same height as me standing in our yard. They were close together and watching me. They had no facial expressions but didn't look threatening, just still, like when you walk up on a deer and it stands there staring at you. I could feel my breath stop when one of them stepped forward and reached an arm out to me as if to say, "Take my hand." Then I heard the same small voice that had been calling me say they were friends of my mother's and they were there to pick me up. Even at 8 years old, I had enough common sense to know that wasn't true. I shook my head firmly and said, "No, you're not my mom's friends." That was when the one who had its arm out walked up to where I was standing and got so close that we were nearly touching. I was face to face with something totally unknown to me. It was another living, breathing being, but not like me. Its skin was light but also textured, and because it was so close to me and with the light from the moon, I could see the faintest layer of fine hair, just like we all have if you look close enough. Its eyes were the most unforgettable part. They were almond-shaped and black, and I just stared at them. I want to add something here. This was not a scary experience. It could be because I was taught from birth to love and respect all living creatures, but I was in a state of amazement, not fear. Then, as if to show me we were more similar than I thought, it reached up and pinched the corner of its own eye and peeled the black part away, exactly like a contact lens being pulled off. And underneath, I saw the most breathtakingly beautiful blue eye I have ever seen. It was deep and clear and larger than any human eye, but still familiar. This image has stayed with me my entire life. I was so focused I didn't even notice the other 2 had also walked close to me, and one of them took my hand to lead me down the walkway and away from the house. I didn't even think about resisting or going back inside. I thought it was amazing and even comforting. The only part I remember about walking down the path was feeling the tiniest pinch on the back of my arm and putting my head down. I was watching my own feet take steps, then I closed my eyes. I don't have any idea what happened after that or where I went with them. The next time my eyes opened, I was on our couch in the living room with a blanket and a pillow, and it was light outside. There were cartoons on TV, and I could hear my mom in the kitchen making breakfast. Apparently, she had found me asleep when she got up to make coffee and had turned on the TV and covered me up. I don't remember if I told her that same morning or later in the day, but when I explained what had happened to me, she openly listened and truly believed me. My mom is the kind of person you can tell anything to without being judged or looked at in a weird way. She even encouraged me to tell my dad too, which I did. They both firmly believe I had some kind of paranormal experience with other life forms, though we can only guess what it was or who they were. The only other memory I have of that morning was checking on Mr. Rabbit. He was perfectly fine and still in his hutch. I even sat with him on my lap and told him the story and how I thought he was calling me. As an adult, I hold this experience close. It's a part of my life and woven into who I am now. I don't share it often, but I don't hide it either. People have always seemed to respond positively to it, curious more than skeptical. What it really gave me, though, was a kind of open door in my mind at an early age. Since that night, I've lived my life totally aware and amazed by the things we can't explain. I like to think of it as a gift that makes my life richer and more mysterious, and really more magical. I also try to remind people that in the big scheme of things, with life and this universe and existence we're all living in, we barely understand a fraction of what's actually going on, and that's being generous. Be open to things that seem impossible, and like my mom and dad taught me through example, be kind if someone shares their experience with you. I've never had anything weird happen to me personally, but a close friend of mine, Brian, said he did, and I think I saw it happen once. This was in the mid-90s in Chillicothe, Ohio. Brian lived right outside of town on heavily wooded land with his parents and his sister. They had a normal main house, but what made it cool when we were young was that they had a big detached garage with 3 doors, tall enough to fit their RV in, and above that there was a second living space, kind of like a studio apartment with a kitchenette and a bathroom. They didn't really use it, so that's where Brian and I would stay when I spent the night out there. It was the best during high school because it felt like we had our own place where we could be loud and play video games all night without bothering anyone. We were normal country boys that loved riding dirt bikes, target shooting in the woods, and talking about girls. But one night when we were 16, the subject of scary stories and ghosts came up while we were staying in the garage. That's when Brian told me something that I never expected to come out of his mouth. He said to me that for as long as he could remember, aliens had been taking him. Like how most people would react, I laughed because he was obviously messing with me, but he got serious about it and he told me it would happen at least once a year, and it had been that way since he could remember. Of course, I had to ask him to elaborate, so he told me he would only remember being taken, then being walked down some kind of hallway. He described it as having rooms down both sides, all with large glass windows, and in each room there was a single person about our age, both boys and girls just sitting in chairs with a horribly blank stare like they didn't even know they were there. That was all he ever said about it. He didn't want to get any deeper into it when I asked, and really, I still thought it was something he was making up since we had just been talking about scary stories. I completely forgot about what he said until maybe a year later. We were seniors in high school and I stayed at his place after a half day of riding dirt bikes. This was a totally normal day. We brought a pizza home and went upstairs for the night. Nothing weird at all happened until about 2 o'clock in the morning. I used to sleep on the pull-out couch and I got up to go to the bathroom. When I stood up, I noticed Brian wasn't in the main bed. I figured he was in the bathroom, so I sat there waiting. After a minute or two, I yelled that I had to go and didn't hear anything back, so I opened the door and found that the bathroom was empty. Still, it was nothing that weird. I just figured he had gone in the house for some reason. After that, I laid back down and was almost asleep when through my closed eyelids, I saw 3 or 4 bright flashes exactly like lightning. The studio had a bunch of windows that looked out behind the garage, so I got up to see if a storm was coming. Out back, maybe 100 feet into the trees, something was glowing and fairly bright. It wasn't the color of fire, but more like floodlights. I remember trying to focus and figure out what it was. Then, like some kind of scary movie, I saw Brian walk out of the woods completely alone and barefoot. I watched him walk all the way across the grass, wondering what in the world he was doing because he seemed as calm as could be. I heard him come in the downstairs door and then walk upstairs, and right away I asked what he was doing. He looked at me dead in the eyes and told me it happened again. In that moment, I had no idea what he was talking about, but then it finally clicked and I remembered what he had told me a year earlier about being abducted. I absolutely thought he was pranking me at this point, and I told him he was ridiculous, which I later regretted saying to him. He didn't even say another word about it other than he was going back to bed. Then he laid down and he was snoring in a matter of minutes. I went back to bed too and was actually lying there thinking of ways to prank him back when I saw the same flashes outside again, but this time with my eyes open. I got up and went to the window again, but everything was dark and quiet, so I never found out what that was. The next day I mostly forgot about it until I was back home. That's when something started bugging me. I really didn't know how he would have pulled off a prank like that or why. There's no way he could have known I'd wake up when I did, and the way he came back in all serious and went straight to bed was also weird. It didn't make any sense as a prank. When we were back at school, I remember bringing it up. He did remember coming upstairs after being outside, but only vaguely, and I have to say he looked like he meant it. He told me a second time too that he wasn't lying when he told me it happened again. I honestly couldn't tell what was up with him or why he was doing this, so I kind of dropped it after that and things just moved on. We stayed really good friends through our senior year, and after graduation we kept in touch and hung out for a few years, but like a lot of those high school friendships, we naturally saw less and less of each other over the years. I'm in my late 40s now, and Brian sadly passed away at 39 from a rare cancer, leaving behind his wife and 2 boys. After he passed, I found myself thinking about him a lot. When someone you grow up with dies young like that, your mind goes all over the place. I was remembering all the things we used to do and the time we spent together, but in all those memories, that one weird experience stood out. Brian was the most normal, regular guy you could ever meet, except for that one weird thing he confessed to me, and the night where he came walking out of the woods. I started to really wish I'd taken him more seriously and spent more time trying to talk about it. Over time, the prank theory made less sense to me. If it had been some kind of joke he was playing on me, it didn't do anything. It didn't get a laugh, it didn't lead to a story he would tell, and he never once smiled about it or brought it up. The only way he ever acted was completely serious. It's all very weird when I think back on it. It makes me want to believe that what he told me was true. Maybe he really was experiencing something on a regular basis. I know that what I saw him do was totally out of character. It didn't change our friendship and we never stopped hanging out because of it, but looking back, I feel like there was this hidden part of his life or something he was dealing with, and I never reached out to him when I had the chance. I want to thank everyone for watching another episode of Skywatcher Stories. If you like hearing these personal experiences of strange sightings and alien encounters, please subscribe because I upload new episodes every week and it really helps the channel. Until next time, keep watching the skies.